8 years ago, on a Thursday night in October, at 11:47 p.m., my fiancé texted me 4 words from a hotel room 2 miles from our apartment. I can't do this. 6 hours later, I was supposed to marry him in front of 230 guests and a caterer who had already charged my father's credit card $84,000. Instead, I spent my wedding morning returning a $22,000 diamond ring to a jeweler on Michigan Avenue who wouldn't look me in the eye. If you're watching this from a city where you once had to drive past your own venue and see another woman's flowers going in the door, comment your city below, and if you've ever had to smile at someone who ruined you, hit like and subscribe right now, because tonight, 8 years later, I finally got to watch that smile disappear. There are 3 things you need to understand before I tell you what happened at the reunion, because none of them made sense to me until they collided in the same room, under the same chandelier, in front of the same 300 people who once watched me get left at the altar. The first thing is money. 6 weeks before the reunion, a routine forensic audit landed on my desk at Sterling & Cole Forensic Analytics, where I've been a senior partner for 4 years. The client was a private equity fund called Ashford Meridian Capital, and buried inside 40,000 pages of wire transfer records was a shell company called Whitfield Capital Partners, run by a man whose signature I would have recognized blindfolded, because I used to trace that same signature on birthday cards for 11 years. Marcus Whitfield, my ex-fiancé, the man who left me the night before our wedding, was quietly bleeding $340,000 a month out of retirement accounts belonging to people who trusted him, and I was the only forensic accountant in Chicago who could prove it, because I had, without knowing it, spent a decade learning exactly how he thought. The second thing is a secret. Bianca Torres was my best friend for 19 years, from the 3rd grade at Holy Trinity Elementary in Oak Park, to the morning she climbed into a car with my fiancé and drove to a hotel instead of coming to help me get dressed. She married him 14 months later in a ceremony I wasn't invited to, and for 8 years she has posted a curated, sun-drenched life on Instagram. Marcus and Bianca at the Whitfield Family Foundation Gala, Marcus and Bianca in Positano, Marcus and Bianca with their son Tyler, age 5, at his soccer games in Lincoln Park. What none of those 300,000 followers knew, what I only found out 4 days before the reunion from a man named Preston Eicher who used to run security for the Whitfield Foundation, was that Bianca had been seeing someone else for the entire length of her marriage. Someone whose face you would recognize instantly if I said his name, which is exactly why I'm not going to say it yet. The third thing is a plan, and it isn't really mine. It belongs to my father, Daniel Reyes, who spent 26 years as a federal judge for the Northern District of Illinois before he retired to a lake house in Lake Geneva that he now uses mostly to fish and to make phone calls that still, somehow, get answered on the first ring. When I brought him the Whitfield Capital file, he didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "Are you okay?" He said, "Elena, who's underwriting their gala insurance this year." And by the time he hung up the phone 40 minutes later, 3 different federal offices knew things about Marcus Whitfield that Marcus Whitfield did not yet know they knew. My father has spent 8 years watching me pretend I was fine. He was not going to let that Thursday night in October be the last word. I need to take you back to the beginning, though, because you can't understand how satisfying that chandelier moment was unless you understand exactly how small Marcus and his family tried to make me feel for 11 years before it happened. I met Marcus Whitfield when I was 23, fresh out of Northwestern with a degree in accounting and a job offer from a mid-size firm that felt like the biggest thing that had ever happened to me. He was 25, the younger son of Diane and the late Charles Whitfield, a Lake Forest family whose name was stitched into half the hospital wings and university buildings on the North Shore, mostly because Charles Whitfield's grandfather had made a fortune in steel fabrication in the 1940s, and the family had spent 3 generations very carefully spending it in public and very quietly running out of it in private. Marcus didn't tell me that second part. Nobody in that family told anybody that second part, ever, about anything. What Marcus told me, on our first date at a restaurant on Rush Street where the valet knew his name, was that he was building something of his own. "I don't want to just inherit a legacy," he said, turning his wine glass by the stem in a way I would later realize was a rehearsed gesture, something he did in every important conversation, a tell I never learned to read as a tell until it was too late to matter. "I want to build something people respect because I earned it." I believed him completely. I was 23 and I had grown up in a modest colonial in Naperville with a father who worked 80-hour weeks on the federal bench and a mother who taught high school biology, and the Whitfield name felt like a door opening into a room I had never been allowed inside. For the first 2 years, Marcus's mother, Diane Whitfield, was polite to me in the specific, chilled way that people are polite when they've already decided you're temporary. She would say things at family dinners like, "Elena, it's so refreshing that you work," with a small laugh that made the word work sound like a hobby I'd taken up out of boredom. Never mind that by 26, I was already billing more hours than anyone else in my department and had passed my CFE certification on the first attempt. Diane Whitfield has one trait, and I want you to remember it because it repeats itself in every single scene I'm about to describe. Arrogance so total that she genuinely could not imagine a version of reality in which her judgment was wrong. She wore it like other people wear perfume. You could smell it before she said a word. Marcus's older brother, Trevor Whitfield, had a different single trait: entitlement. The specific, aggressive kind that comes from never once in 34 years being told no and meaning it. Trevor had been between ventures for as long as I knew him. A failed restaurant on Damon Avenue that closed after 14 months, a real estate app that never launched, a wine importing business that existed mostly as a LinkedIn headline. Every one of those ventures had been seeded with money that came, in one circuitous way or another, from Marcus. And every time I asked, gently, whether that was sustainable, Marcus would say, "Family takes care of family, Elena," in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over, and that I, notably, was not quite family enough to have an opinion about it. I want to tell you about the night I understood, for the first time, that something underneath all of it didn't add up, because it happened 4 years into our relationship, 18 months before the wedding, at a dinner at the Whitfield house on Sheridan Road in Lake Forest. The one with the boathouse and the tennis court that Diane liked to mention had just been resurfaced, $12,000. Can you imagine? I was sitting at the far end of a table set for 14, doing what I always did at Whitfield family gatherings, which was quietly running numbers in my head. Because it turns out you cannot spend a decade training as a forensic accountant and simply turn that instinct off at a dinner party. I watched Charles Whitfield, Marcus's father, then 71 and 18 months from the stroke that would kill him, wince almost imperceptibly when the topic of the foundation's annual gala came up. And Diane said brightly, "Oh, Marcus is handling all of that now, aren't you, darling?" And Marcus said, "Handled," with the same practiced ease he'd used on our first date, turning his wine glass by the stem. I didn't think much of it that night. I was 27, in love, and very good at not asking questions that might crack something I badly wanted to believe was solid. It would be another 6 years, a broken engagement, a forensic audit for an entirely unrelated client, and one very determined federal judge before I understood what handled actually meant. The wedding planning itself took 11 months, and looking back, I can see now that it was the moment when the gap between what the Whitfield name represented and what it could actually afford started to become impossible to hide, even from someone as willfully unobservant as I was being at the time. Diane insisted on the Drake Hotel's Gold Coast room, capacity 250, minimum spend $140,000 before flowers, before the band, before the open bar that Trevor's college roommates would later drink through in under 90 minutes at the rehearsal dinner alone. When my father, ever the careful federal employee, gently asked how the costs were being split, Diane said, with a small, tight smile I now recognize as one of her signature moves, "Oh, the Whitfields have always hosted. It's tradition." And then, 3 weeks later, a $31,000 deposit invoice arrived at my father's house instead of hers, forwarded, she said, for safekeeping. My father paid it without telling me. He told me that 8 years later, at the lake house, the same day I brought him the Whitfield capital file, and it was the first time in my adult life I ever saw him cry. The night before the wedding, I was at my parents' house in Naperville, steaming a dress that had cost more than my first car, listening to my mother read the seating chart out loud for the 9th time, when my phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. 4 words. I can't do this. I called him 14 times. I called Bianca 11 times, because in the panic of that first hour, before I understood anything, she was still the person I reached for, the person I had reached for since I was 8 years old, and she moved in 3 houses down from mine on Elm Street in Oak Park. She didn't answer either. At 6:15 the next morning, my father drove to the Whitfield house on Sheridan Road, still in his robe, and Diane Whitfield answered the door and said, and I remember this because my father repeated it to me word for word with his jaw so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. "Judge Reyes, I really think this is between the children, don't you?" As though her 36-year-old son abandoning a bride 6 hours before a $140,000 wedding was a scraped knee on a playground. It took 4 more days for me to learn where Marcus actually was. He was at the Peninsula Hotel, room 1407, with Bianca. They had left together the previous evening, after the rehearsal dinner, while I was at my parents' house steaming a dress. 19 years of friendship, 11 years of my relationship, and it turned out the two of them had been circling each other for at least the final 7 months of my engagement, trading the kind of texts I would only see printed out, months later, in a discovery packet from a lawsuit that never actually went anywhere, because Marcus's family lawyer buried it in delay motions until I simply stopped being able to afford to keep fighting. I moved back in with my parents for 4 months. I lost 11 pounds I didn't have to lose. I did not, contrary to what half of Oak Park apparently assumed, disappear from public life, or change my name, or move to another city, though God knows I thought about all three. What I did instead, and I didn't fully understand this decision until years later, was throw myself into becoming the best forensic accountant in the state of Illinois. Because for the first time in my adult life, I had discovered that there was one skill I possessed that Marcus Whitfield's entire family, with all their tennis courts and resurfaced boathouses, did not. I knew how to find money that people were trying very hard to hide. I got my certified fraud examiner credential 11 months after the wedding that never happened, top of my cohort, and I took a job at Sterling & Cole, a boutique forensic accounting firm on LaSalle Street that specialized in exactly the kind of work most people find boring: tracing money through shell companies, reconciling ledgers that had been deliberately made to not reconcile, finding the exact date and the exact wire transfer where someone's story stopped matching their bank statements. I was good at it in a way that surprised even me. My managing partner, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Renata Cole, used to say I had an accountant's nose for a liar's face, and she wasn't wrong. 8 years of watching Marcus Whitfield turn a wine glass by its stem every time he said something he didn't fully believe had trained me, without my realizing it, to watch for exactly that kind of tell in every room I ever walked into again. Bianca and Marcus married 14 months after the wedding that wasn't mine anymore, in a ceremony at the same Drake Hotel ballroom, the invitation for which I only saw because my cousin Priya, who still ran in some of the same social circles, forwarded me a photo of it with the caption, "Did you know?" I did not know. I found out from a cousin's screenshot that my former best friend was marrying my former fiancé in the exact room where I was supposed to get married, 8 months after I'd finally stopped crying every time I heard the song we'd chosen for our first dance. I remember sitting on the floor of my studio apartment on Wells Street, 28 years old, with the phone in my hand, and I remember the specific, cold clarity that settled over me instead of the tears I expected. I did not cry. I opened my laptop instead, and I worked until 2 in the morning on a case involving a construction company skimming $1.2 million from a municipal contract, because work, I had learned, was the one place where the ground never suddenly disappeared from under me. Over the next 7 years, I built a career that, if I'm honest, the old Elena, the one steaming a wedding dress in Naperville, would not have recognized. I made partner at 31, the youngest in the firm's history. I testified as an expert witness in 11 federal fraud trials. I was profiled in Crane's Chicago Business in a piece titled The Number Whisperer, which Diane Whitfield, I would later learn from my cousin Priya, framed and hung in her powder room, not because she was proud of me, but because she liked to tell guests, "We practically raised her, you know." As though 11 years of condescension and a $31,000 invoice forwarded for safekeeping constituted raising someone. Marcus, meanwhile, built something too, though it took me years to understand what it actually was. Publicly, Whitfield Capital Partners was a boutique wealth management firm on Michigan Avenue, 42nd floor, glass walls, a lobby with a sculpture that I later learned had been purchased for $180,000 from a gallery that Trevor's ex-girlfriend happened to work at. Marcus's LinkedIn described him as founder and managing partner, stewarding generational wealth for North Shore families since 2019. He posted photos from Davos that he was not actually invited to attend as a speaker, dinners at Charlie Trotter's successor restaurants, a Range Rover he leased but photographed at angles that made it look owned outright. Bianca's Instagram, @BiancaWhitfieldStyle, 311,000 followers, sold the rest of the fantasy. Linen dresses in Positano, a family capsule wardrobe sponsored by a children's boutique in Winnetka, Tyler's 5th birthday party at the Whitfield house with a professional balloon arch that cost, I would later find in a subpoenaed invoice, $4,200. None of it, and I want to be very precise about this because precision is the only thing I have ever really trusted, was paid for with money the Whitfield family actually had. The audit that changed everything landed on my desk on a Tuesday in early spring. a case file thick enough that our office manager had joked about needing a hand truck to move it from the mailroom. The client was Ashford Meridian Capital, a private equity fund headquartered in Chicago whose limited partners included several pension funds, 2 university endowments, and notably, a state senator named Richard Ashford, whose family had founded the fund 3 generations earlier and who still sat on its advisory board despite having moved into public office 14 years prior. Ashford Meridian's compliance team had flagged an irregularity in a sub-advisory relationship, a boutique manager overseeing a $6.4 million discretionary sleeve of client assets, supposedly invested in a diversified basket of municipal bonds and blue-chip equities, had produced quarterly statements that, on paper, looked immaculate. Steady 7% annual returns, conservative allocation, exactly the kind of low-drama performance that keeps compliance departments from asking questions. It took me 4 days to find the first inconsistency, and I remember the exact moment, 9:52 p.m. on a Thursday, alone in the office with a cold coffee and 3 monitors, when I cross-referenced the custodial bank's actual trade confirmations against the quarterly statements Whitfield Capital Partners had sent to Ashford Meridian's limited partners. The trade confirmations didn't exist, not didn't match, didn't exist. Whitfield Capital had never actually purchased a single one of the securities listed on 11 consecutive quarterly statements. The $6.4 million wasn't invested anywhere. It had been wired in 19 separate transfers over 31 months, ranging from $40,000 to $340,000 each, into 4 different accounts, one belonging to Whitfield Capital Partners' operating account, one belonging to a shell entity called WCP Holdings LLC registered to a UPS store mailbox in Winnetka, one belonging directly to Marcus Whitfield personally, and this is the one that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the screen for a full minute without breathing, belonging to Diane Whitfield. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something colder and more clinical. The same feeling I imagine a surgeon has when an X-ray confirms exactly what they suspected. Not happiness, just confirmation. And underneath it, a low hum of dread. Because I understood immediately that this was not going to be a simple compliance flag I could hand off to a junior associate. This was the man who left me the night before our wedding, laundering stolen retirement money through his mother's bank account, and I was the only person in Chicago who had both the forensic skill and, God help me, the personal motive to follow it all the way to the end. I didn't touch the file again that night. I closed my laptop, sat in the dark of my apartment on Wells Street, a different apartment by then, a 2-bedroom I'd bought outright at 30 with the first real bonus Sterling & Cole had ever paid me, and I called the one person I trusted to tell me whether I was seeing what I thought I was seeing, or whether 8 years of unresolved anger had finally started coloring the numbers. My father picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, even at 10:40 at night, even 4 years into retirement. I read him the account numbers, I read him the dates. I told him whose names were on the wires. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I asked if he was still there. And when he finally spoke, his voice had the particular flatness I remembered from when he used to talk about sentencing hearings. The voice he used when he had already decided something was true and was simply working out the mechanics of what came next. "Send me the QSIP numbers," he said. "And Elena, don't file anything yet. Not with the firm, not with Ashford Meridian's compliance desk. Not until I make one call." My father spent 26 years on the federal bench, and in that time he built the kind of relationships that don't show up on any org chart, but that outlast every administration, every U.S. attorney, every change in political weather. The call he made the next morning was to a woman named Patricia Delgado, a regional director at the SEC's Chicago office, who had clerked for my father 22 years earlier, back when she was a 26-year-old law student, and he was already, in her words, the only judge in that building who ever actually read the briefs. He didn't tell her the personal history. He didn't have to. He gave her 4 sentences, a fund name, a sub-advisor, a dollar figure, and the words custodial mismatch. I'd stake my reputation on it. And by that Friday afternoon, the SEC had quietly opened a matter under inquiry file on Whitfield Capital Partners, 3 weeks before I would even see Marcus Whitfield in person again. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't know for another 11 days, until Preston Eicher called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning, was how deep the second problem went, the one that had nothing to do with money at all. Preston Eicher had worked event security for the Whitfield Family Foundation for 6 years before he was let go the previous winter, officially for budget restructuring. Unofficially, as he told me over coffee at a diner on Clark Street that smelled like burnt toast and old coffee grounds, because he'd caught Bianca Whitfield in a stairwell at the Foundation's winter benefit with a man Preston recognized immediately. Because half of Illinois would have recognized him immediately. State Senator Richard Ashford, 49 years old, silver-templed, the kind of politician whose face had been on enough campaign billboards along the Kennedy Expressway that recognizing him was less like recognizing a stranger and more like recognizing a brand. Preston had said nothing at the time, not my business, not my paycheck to risk. But he'd kept the timestamp in his head, the way security people do. An old habit he couldn't shake even after he was gone. 9:14 p.m., Stairwell B, West Wing, the Whitfield Foundation's Winter Wonderland Gala, 11 months before the reunion. I want to pause here and tell you something I didn't understand until much later. Richard Ashford wasn't just some man Bianca happened to meet at a gala. He was the same Richard Ashford whose family fund, Ashford Meridian Capital, had hired my firm to audit the very sub-advisory relationship that led me straight to Marcus. I did not choose that case because of Bianca. I did not even know when I opened that file on a Tuesday in early spring that the two threads were connected at all. It was Preston Eicher's phone call 11 days later that collapsed them into a single story, and it was in that diner on Clark Street, stirring sugar into coffee I never drank, that I first understood the full shape of what I was looking at. My ex-fiancé was stealing from a fund controlled by the very man his wife had been sleeping with for years, and neither one of them had the faintest idea that the other secret existed, let alone that I was the one holding both threads in my hands. Preston told me more that morning than I expected him to. More than, frankly, I think he'd told anyone. He told me the affair with Ashford wasn't new. He'd clocked at least 4 other encounters over 3 years, always at Foundation events, always brief, always conducted with the practiced choreography of 2 people who had done this many times before and had never once been caught by anyone who mattered. He told me Tyler, 5 years old, the boy in every one of Bianca's sun-drenched Instagram photos, had been born 9 months and 6 days after a Foundation gala in Lake Geneva, that Preston remembered specifically because he'd worked overtime security that weekend, and Marcus had been away the entire time, in Aspen. Closing what he'd told colleagues was the biggest deal of my career, a deal that, I would later confirm through the SEC's own investigative file, never actually existed. Preston didn't know for certain who Tyler's biological father was. Neither did I, not yet. But the arithmetic sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of that day, and it would not let go. I met Trevor Whitfield twice during the 6 weeks between opening the Ashford Meridian file and the night of the reunion. Both times by what looked like coincidence and were, in fact, engineered by my father, who had quietly decided that if the SEC needed a fuller picture of how deep the Whitfield family's dependency on Marcus's fraudulent income actually went, the fastest way to get it was to let Trevor talk, because Trevor Whitfield, given an open bar and an audience, has never in his life been capable of not talking. The first time was at a fundraiser for the lyric opera that my firm sponsored a table at, an event I would ordinarily have found some excuse to avoid, except that my father had mentioned, almost too casually, that the Whitfield table was seated adjacent to ours. Trevor found me at the bar within 11 minutes of my arrival. He has always had an instinct for finding money, or people who might have some, and by his third scotch he was telling me, unprompted, about the new restaurant concept he was incubating, a raw bar on Randolph Street he estimated would need $650,000 in seed capital, which honestly, Marcus is basically already committed to. We just need to finalize the structure. I asked, gently, the way I always used to ask, whether Whitfield Capital had that kind of liquidity available given market conditions, and Trevor laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Elena, come on, you know Marcus, he always finds a way. That's just who he is." I did know Marcus. That was exactly the problem. I now knew precisely what finding a way meant, down to the CUSIP number. The second time was 3 weeks later, at a Whitfield Family Foundation board dinner that I attended, uninvited by anyone except my father's careful maneuvering and a mutual acquaintance who still, inexplicably, thought Elena and the Whitfields might someday patch things up. Trevor was seated 2 chairs down, deeper into a bottle of Barolo than the hour really justified. And when the topic of the Foundation's upcoming reunion gala came up, the 10th reunion of our graduating class at Lake Forest Academy, which the Whitfield Foundation had, for reasons of pure image management, offered to underwrite and host at the Drake, Trevor leaned toward me and said, in the particular stage whisper of a man who believes he is being discreet, "You know Mom insisted on the Drake again. Obviously, Has to be the Drake. But between you and me, Elena, cash flow's been weird lately. Marcus keeps saying it's temporary. I said nothing. I smiled, the way I had trained myself to smile at every Whitfield family function for 11 years. And underneath the table, I opened the notes app on my phone and typed, "Cash flow weird, per Trevor, board dinner, confirms Marcus stalling family on liquidity, timestamp 8:41 p.m. I would hand that note, along with 6 others like it, to Patricia Delgado's investigative team 4 days before the reunion. Diane Whitfield I saved for last, because Diane was the one I actually had to be careful with. Trevor talks because he's never learned not to. Diane doesn't talk unless she believes talking serves her, and the only way I ever got anything useful out of her was by letting her believe, completely, that I still wanted her approval, which is a performance I had, by that point, been giving for 11 years and had gotten uncomfortably good at. I ran into her, engineered again, though she never once suspected it, at a luncheon for the Lake Forest Academy Alumni Guild, an organization I technically still belonged to only because I'd never bothered to formally resign. A small oversight that turned out to be worth more than anything else I did that spring. Diane was seated at the head table, 63 years old, silver hair set in the same chignon she'd worn since I met her, wearing a Chanel jacket I recognized because I'd once, years earlier, helped her decide between it and a nearly identical one in navy, back when she still occasionally pretended to value my opinion on things that didn't matter. She waved me over with 2 fingers, the way you'd summon a waiter, and said, "Elena, darling, you look thin. Are you eating?" A sentence I want you to notice contains, in 6 words, both an insult and a claim of intimacy she had not earned in 8 years of silence. I asked about the reunion gala. I asked, specifically and carefully, whether the foundation's underwriting of the venue meant the Whitfield family was personally covering the difference between the gala's ticket revenue and its actual cost, a difference I already knew, from the SEC's preliminary asset trace, to be somewhere north of $210,000. Diane's face did the thing it always did when she was about to say something untrue with total conviction. A small lift of the chin, a softening around the eyes that looked, to anyone who didn't know her, like warmth. "Marcus has been so generous," she said. "He insisted the foundation shouldn't have to worry about the shortfall this year. He's really come into his own, you know. I always knew he would." She said this, "I want you to understand, 3 weeks after Trevor told me cash flow was weird, and 4 weeks after I had personally traced $340,000 a month, leaving retirement accounts that belonged to school teachers and municipal employees, and in one case, a retired Chicago firefighter named Walter Osei, who had trusted Whitfield Capital Partners with the entirety of his pension rollover." Diane Whitfield was standing in a Chanel jacket at a luncheon, telling me her son had come into his own, while that firefighter's pension was quietly being used to underwrite a gala celebrating a marriage built on a lie and a career built on theft. I smiled. I told her the gala sounded wonderful. I did not, even then, feel the satisfaction I expected to feel, because satisfaction, I was learning, was not going to come from small moments like this one. It was going to come from one moment, in one room, that I hadn't even fully designed yet. Camille Torres, Bianca's younger sister, was the piece I almost missed entirely, and I only found her because Preston Eicher mentioned, almost as an afterthought over that same diner coffee, that Camille had started working at Whitfield Capital Partners 18 months earlier, officially as Director of Client Relations, a title that meant nothing at a firm with, as far as I could determine from the SEC's staffing records, 4 actual employees. Camille had spent most of her 20s bouncing between marketing jobs at boutique fitness studios on the North Shore, always chasing whatever seemed most adjacent to money without ever quite landing inside it. And when her sister married into the Whitfield name, Camille had positioned herself, patiently and without much subtlety, as the person who made herself indispensable to keeping the family's secrets organized. She booked Bianca's hair appointments around Ashford's legislative schedule so the timing would never look suspicious to anyone cross-referencing a public calendar. She signed for packages at a P.O. box in Winnetka that turned out, when the SEC subpoenaed the box's registration records, to be the mailing address for WCP Holdings LLC, the same shell entity that had received $1.1 million of the stolen retirement funds. Camille Torres never asked where the money came from. She asked. According to 2 internal Whitfield Capital emails the SEC would later place into evidence, whether her consulting retainer could be increased to $9,000 a month given the increased scope of responsibilities, a request Marcus approved 11 days later, in an email with the subject line re-comp adjustment, 4 words that would end up, months afterward, printed in 14-point font on an exhibit board in a federal courtroom. I met Camille exactly once before the reunion, at a spin studio in Lincoln Park that I'd started attending specifically because Preston told me it was where she taught a 6 a.m. class 3 days a week. And I want to be honest that this is the one piece of the whole 6 weeks I'm least proud of. The one moment where the forensic accountant in me and the woman who'd been humiliated 8 years earlier stopped being fully separable. I took her class. I let her adjust my form on the bike. I told her, afterward, over the protein shakes the studio sold at the front counter, that I'd heard she was doing big things at Whitfield Capital now, and she lit up in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how she saw her own role in what was happening. "It's honestly the best opportunity I've ever had," she said, stirring her shake with a paper straw. "Marcus really trusts me with a lot. I mean, I basically run half the operational side now." I asked casually what operational meant at a firm that size, and she said, without a flicker of hesitation, "Oh, mostly just, keeping things organized. Making sure things go where they're supposed to go." Opportunism, I would come to understand, doesn't always look like greed. Sometimes it looks exactly like gratitude, worn as a shield against ever having to ask the one question that would have made all of it impossible to keep doing. By the time I left that spin studio, I had 4 secondary antagonists mapped with the same precision I would apply to any forensic case file. Diane, arrogant enough to believe her son's theft was simply him coming into his own. Trevor, entitled enough to spend $650,000 of stolen retirement funds on a raw bar and call it family taking care of family. Camille, opportunistic enough to accept a $9,000 a month consulting retainer for making sure stolen money went where it was supposed to go, and never once ask where that was. And underneath all 3 of them, holding the whole structure up, Marcus, the man who had once told me, at 25, turning a wine glass by its stem, that he wanted to build something people respected, because he'd earned it. He had built something, in the end. He'd just never earned a single dollar of it. If you've ever watched a family close ranks around someone who was clearly lying, comment "closed ranks" below, because in about 6 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what happens when the people underwriting that lie finally run out of places to hide. And if this story is hitting close to home for you already, do me a favor and hit subscribe now, because the next part is the reason I'm telling this story in the first place. The paternity question sat unresolved for 3 of the 6 weeks, and I want to tell you honestly that I almost let it go. Because some nights, lying awake in the apartment on Wells Street, I asked myself what right I had to dig into whether a 5-year-old boy's biological father was a state senator instead of the man raising him. It wasn't my business, strictly speaking. It had nothing to do with the SEC's matter under inquiry, nothing to do with Walter Osei's stolen pension, nothing to do with any of the 41 other victims whose names I now knew by heart from the custodial account records. But then I would think about Bianca climbing into a car with Marcus the night before my wedding, about the 11 phone calls she never returned, about the ceremony I wasn't invited to 14 months later, and something in me, not the forensic accountant, the other part, the part that had spent 8 years being told I was being too sensitive every single time I noticed something was wrong, decided I was going to know the truth, all of it, before that reunion happened, because I was done being the only person in every room who didn't know what everyone else already suspected. I found the answer in the end through a route so mundane it almost embarrassed me. A paternity testing lab's billing records, discovered entirely by accident while the SEC's forensic team was subpoenaing Marcus's personal credit card statements as part of the asset tracing effort. Buried in 11 months of restaurant charges and a suspicious number of transactions at a jewelry store on Oak Street. Gifts, I would later learn, for Camille, not Bianca. Evidence of an entirely separate, smaller betrayal I never bothered to fully investigate because by then I genuinely didn't have the emotional bandwidth to care. Was a single charge, $890, paid to a private genetics laboratory in Skokie, dated 14 months after Tyler's birth. Marcus had ordered a paternity test. Quietly, privately, using a personal credit card he apparently believed no one would ever cross-reference against anything else, 14 months after his son was born, which told me 2 things with total certainty. First, that Marcus already suspected what I suspected, and second, that whatever the test revealed, he had chosen, deliberately and for 4 straight years, to keep raising that boy as his own son, rather than confront what it would mean to admit the truth, publicly, as a man whose entire adult identity was built on the appearance of having it all. I never saw the actual test result. The lab's records, protected by medical privacy law, weren't part of what the SEC's subpoena could reach. And I made a decision, One of the only decisions in this entire 6 weeks that I'm genuinely proud of, not to pursue it further through less legal means, though God knows Preston Eicher offered, more than once, to make a call. I didn't need the lab result. I had something better. I had the date. 14 months after Tyler's birth, a $890 charge, a private genetics lab, and a marriage that continued, publicly, flawlessly, for 4 more years afterward, built entirely on a silence that both Marcus and Bianca had apparently agreed, without ever saying so out loud, was easier to maintain than the truth. I called Richard Ashford's office twice during those 6 weeks, both times using my professional title, both times requesting a meeting regarding a compliance matter related to Ashford Meridian Capital's sub-advisory relationships, language deliberately bloodless enough that no one on his staff would think twice about scheduling it. I met him once, in a conference room on the 31st floor of a building on Wacker Drive that his family's fund had occupied for 4 decades. And I want to describe him honestly, because he was not what I expected. He was tired. 49 years old, silver-templed, exactly as Preston had described, but with the specific, brittle exhaustion of a man who has spent years managing a secret that keeps threatening to outgrow the size of the box he built for it. When I laid out, in careful, procedural language, exactly what my audit had found regarding Whitfield Capital's misuse of Ashford Meridian assets, he went very still, and then he said something I have thought about many times since. I always told myself I'd do something about Tyler once he was old enough to understand. I kept moving the date. I didn't ask him what he meant by do something. I think, looking back, he wasn't entirely sure himself. But I watched something shift in his face in that conference room, a decision crystallizing in real time, and 3 days later his office confirmed, through a scheduling assistant who had no idea what she was actually confirming, that Senator Ashford would be attending the Lake Forest Academy 10th Reunion Gala as a guest of the Whitfield Family Foundation, a courtesy invitation the foundation had extended to him for years as a major donor, and that he would, for the first time in his public life, be bringing his son. His son. Not Tyler, a different son, a 2-year-old named Miles, born to a woman named Sarah Kessler, a legislative aide Ashford had been quietly involved with for the past 3 years, a relationship that had produced a child he had, unlike with Tyler, chosen to acknowledge from the beginning, quietly, out of the press's view, supporting Sarah and Miles from a distance while maintaining, at Bianca's own repeated panicked insistence, complete public silence about any connection to the Whitfield family at all. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it when Ashford's chief of staff mentioned it to me, almost in passing, as though it were the least remarkable detail in the entire conversation. Richard Ashford had 2 sons by 2 different women, both affairs conducted alongside marriages and relationships that both women believed, or chose to believe, were something closer to exclusive. He had decided to keep Miles a secret for entirely different reasons than he'd kept his suspicions about Tyler a secret. One out of political calculation, one out of a cowardice he all but admitted to me himself in that conference room. But on the night of the reunion, for reasons that had far less to do with any plan of mine than with a decision Richard Ashford finally made on his own, both secrets were going to walk into the same room, at the same time, in the arms of a 5-year-old boy nobody there had ever met. I did not orchestrate that part. I want to be completely clear about that, because I have thought, many times since, about how much of what happened that night I actually engineered, and how much simply arrived, the way a debt eventually arrives regardless of how long you've managed to avoid the collector. I orchestrated the SEC's timeline. I orchestrated the moment my father's contacts would move from quiet investigation to formal action. I did not orchestrate Richard Ashford's decision to finally, after years of moving the date, show up to a gala with the son he'd never publicly claimed, at the exact event where his other son's mother would be standing in a room full of people who thought they already knew the whole story of her life. Some debts, it turns out, collect themselves. Patricia Delgado's team moved faster than even my father expected. And I think part of that speed came from the sheer clarity of the evidence I was able to hand them. 19 wire transfers, 4 recipient accounts, 11 quarterly statements referencing securities that had never been purchased, and a paper trail so clean that one of her junior investigators told me, during a deposition prep session 4 days before the reunion, that it was the most well-organized fraud referral I've seen from a private sector source in 6 years, which I chose to take, given the circumstances, as the highest compliment of my professional life. But clean evidence and a completed investigation are 2 different things. And by the Monday before the reunion, Patricia's team still needed one more piece before they could move from matter under inquiry to formal enforcement action. Confirmation. from Whitfield Capital's actual custodial bank that the $6.4 million had never been repositioned into legitimate assets at any point, that the fraud was ongoing and not merely historical, because ongoing fraud gave the SEC's Division of Enforcement, working in coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office, grounds for an emergency asset freeze rather than a slower civil process that could take 18 months to produce any consequence at all. That confirmation came on Wednesday, 2 days before the reunion, in the form of a subpoenaed statement from First Meridian Trust Bank, showing that as of the previous Friday, Whitfield Capital Partners' operating account held $340,000, the exact monthly draw amount I had identified back in early spring, and that $190,000 of it had been wired out that same week to cover, according to the bank's internal notes, event and venue costs, Drake Hotel, per client instruction. Marcus Whitfield was funding the reunion gala, the one his own mother was hosting to celebrate the Whitfield Foundation's continued generosity toward Lake Forest Academy, using money stolen 4 weeks earlier from a retired Chicago firefighter's pension rollover. Patricia called me herself to tell me that detail, and I remember she paused for a long moment before she said it, as though she wasn't sure how I'd take hearing that the very party where I was about to be publicly humiliated all over again, because Diane had made sure, through the reunion committee's seating chart, that I was placed at a table directly facing the head table where Marcus and Bianca would be seated, was being paid for with stolen money. I told her the truth. It made the whole thing easier. It meant there was no version of that night where I had to sit quietly and watch Marcus Whitfield perform generosity he hadn't earned. Because by the time the appetizers were served, everyone in that room was going to know exactly what he'd actually done. The SEC's asset freeze order was signed by a federal magistrate judge, not my father, who had recused himself from any formal role the moment I brought him the case, understanding better than anyone the ethics of a judge, even a retired one, appearing to use his influence on behalf of his own daughter. At 4:15 p.m. on the Friday of the reunion, 6 hours before the gala's cocktail hour was scheduled to begin, the order froze all assets held by Whitfield Capital Partners, WCP Holdings LLC, and, in a provision that made Patricia's junior investigator actually laugh out loud when he read it to me over the phone, any accounts held by immediate family members of Marcus Whitfield, determined to have received transfers traceable to client funds, a clause that covered, specifically and by name, Diane Whitfield's personal checking account at First Meridian Trust, the same account that had received $1.1 million over 31 months. 2 FBI agents assigned to assist the SEC's parallel criminal referral, because by Wednesday, given the scale of the fraud and the number of victims, the U.S. Attorney's Office had opened its own criminal investigation alongside the civil enforcement action, would be present at the gala that evening, in plain clothes, credentialed as guests through a mechanism Patricia never fully explained to me and that I never asked about, because I understood, by then, that there are some doors my father's decades on the bench could open that were better left slightly mysterious. I got dressed for the reunion at 6:40 p.m. that Friday, alone in the apartment on Wells Street, and I want to tell you honestly that my hands were not steady. I had spent 6 weeks being the calmest, most procedurally precise version of myself I had ever managed to be, reading account statements without flinching, sitting across a table from Trevor Whitfield while he bragged about a raw bar funded with stolen pensions, smiling at Diane in a Chanel jacket while she told me her son had come into his own. And now, alone, zipping a dress I'd bought specifically for that night, deep emerald green. Not because it was flattering, though it was, but because it was the exact color Marcus had once told me, 11 years earlier, on our first date at that restaurant on Rush Street, was his favorite color on a woman, I felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, something closer to fear than resolve. Not fear of Marcus, fear of the version of myself who had spent 8 years pretending that Thursday night in October hadn't cost her anything, and who was about to walk into a ballroom and find out, in front of 300 people, whether that pretending had actually worked. My father called at 6:52 p.m., 8 minutes before my car service arrived. He didn't ask if I was ready. He said, "Patricia's team confirmed the agents are in position. Diane's checking account is frozen as of an hour ago. She doesn't know yet. And Elena," he paused, and I could hear, even over the phone, the particular gravity he used to bring to a courtroom before he delivered a verdict. "Whatever happens tonight, you didn't do this to them. They did this to themselves. You just finally had the tools to prove it." I have thought about that sentence many times since because it turned out to be the single most important thing anyone said to me during those entire 6 weeks, the thing that let me walk into that ballroom without the weight of feeling like I was the villain of someone else's story, when for 8 years, in the quiet corners of my own mind, some part of me had never fully stopped believing that maybe I was. The Drake Hotel's Gold Coast room looked exactly the way it had looked 8 years earlier, on the morning I never got to walk into it as a bride. And I want to tell you that detail hit me harder than I expected. The same crystal chandeliers, the same gold leaf ceiling medallions, the same particular smell of orchids and candle wax that I had spent 3 months, 8 years ago, obsessing over with a wedding planner named Genevieve, who had since retired and moved to Sarasota. Diane Whitfield had chosen the venue again, deliberately, I am certain, though she would never have admitted it, because Diane Whitfield's entire worldview depended on the idea that some rooms belong permanently to some families, and that nothing that happened inside them, not a canceled wedding, not a federal fraud investigation, not a 5-year-old boy whose paternity had been quietly tested and quietly buried, could ever actually change who got to stand at the center of it. I arrived at 7:35 p.m., not fashionably late, not painfully early, timed precisely, because Patricia had asked me to arrive close to when the agents would already be settled into position near the room's 2 main exits, credentialed as Foundation Donor Liaisons, a cover story thin enough that I found myself hoping no one would ask them a single follow-up question about the Foundation's actual donor base. The room was already half full, 300 people eventually, classmates I hadn't seen in a decade, spouses I'd never met, the specific hum of a North Shore social event where everyone is simultaneously catching up and quietly, competitively, assessing whose life had turned out better. I felt, walking in, exactly the way I had felt walking into every Whitfield family function for 11 years. Watched, measured, and slightly smaller than the room wanted me to be. The difference, this time, was that I knew something none of the 300 people measuring me knew, and that knowledge sat in my chest like ballast, keeping me steady in a way 11 years of trying to earn Diane Whitfield's approval never had. Marcus found me at 8:10 p.m., near the bar, and I want to describe exactly how he looked, because I had spent 8 years half expecting to feel something, grief, longing, the ghost of whatever I used to feel at 25, and instead I felt almost nothing at all, which was its own kind of relief. He was heavier than I remembered, his tailored jacket straining slightly at the shoulders in a way that suggested a tailor who had not been paid to update the fit in some time, and there was a particular tightness around his eyes that I recognized immediately, because it was the same tightness I'd started noticing on Charles Whitfield's face, years earlier, right before the topic of the Foundation Gala came up at that dinner on Sheridan Road. Marcus was a man managing a performance that had gotten harder to maintain every single year, and I could see it now with a clarity that 8 years earlier I had actively refused to let myself have. "Elena Reyes," he said, and he smiled, the full, practiced Whitfield smile, the one that had once made me feel like the luckiest woman on the North Shore. "You look incredible, genuinely." He turned his wine glass by the stem, the exact gesture unchanged in 8 years, and something in me almost laughed out loud at how completely, comically consistent a liar can be across an entire decade. We made small talk for 4 minutes, my firm, his firm, Tyler's soccer team, a subject he brought up himself, with a warmth in his voice that I now understood was either genuine, in which case it made everything sadder, or performed, in which case it made everything colder, and I honestly could not tell you, even now, which one it was. And then, because Marcus Whitfield has never in his life been able to resist the temptation to remind someone that he won, he leaned slightly closer, lowered his voice into the register he used to use for things he considered charmingly honest, and said the sentence that, 8 years later, would end up quoted back to him by a federal prosecutor in an opening statement. "You know, Elena, I think about it sometimes, that night, and I want you to know I don't regret it. Leaving you was the best decision I ever made." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that his smile flickered, just slightly, the first crack I'd seen in it all night, and I said, "I actually think you're right, Marcus. I think it probably was." He laughed, delighted, misreading me completely, the way he had misread almost everything about me for the entire 11 years I knew him, and he turned to signal the bartender for another drink, and it was in that exact moment, 8:19 p.m., I would check my phone later and confirm the timestamp, that the doors at the far end of the Gold Coast room opened, and Richard Ashford walked in. He was alone at first, just for a second, long enough for a ripple of recognition to move through the room the way it always does when someone whose face has been on campaign billboards along the Kennedy Expressway walks into a party full of people who follow local politics the way other people follow sports teams. And then, a half step behind him, a woman I didn't recognize, Sarah Kessler, I would learn later, in a simple navy dress, her expression tight with a nervousness that told me she had no idea, walking through those doors, just how large a moment she was about to become part of. And between them, holding both their hands, a small boy in a little navy blazer, his hair combed carefully to one side, looking around the enormous, chandeliered room with the wide, uncomplicated wonder of a 5-year-old at his first grown-up party. Miles Ashford, 2 years old, actually, not 5. I want to correct something I said earlier, because in the retelling this detail has gotten confused so many times that even I sometimes misremember it. But Miles was 2, walking somewhat unsteadily, his small hand gripping his father's fingers, and it was Tyler, Bianca and Marcus's son, 5 years old, who had arrived earlier with a nanny and was seated at a children's table near the back of the room with 3 other kids from the reunion committee's families, whose presence in that same room, at that same event, made the whole thing collapse the way it did. Richard Ashford had not, in the end, brought a 5-year-old boy through those doors. He had brought a 2-year-old son the room didn't know existed into the same space as a 5-year-old son the room had watched grow up on Instagram for years. And it was the simple, unbearable math of 2 children who should never have been photographed within 100 yards of each other, standing 40 feet apart in the same ballroom that did what 6 weeks of forensic accounting alone never could have. It made the lie visible to everyone at once, without a single word needing to be said. Bianca was standing near the head table when it happened, in a champagne-colored gown, mid-conversation with 2 women I recognized from our graduating class, a glass of Sancerre in her hand, and I watched her face change in real time as her eyes moved from Richard Ashford to Sarah Kessler to the small boy between them, and then, involuntarily, helplessly, across the room to where Tyler sat at the children's table, oblivious, coloring on a paper placemat. I have relived that 4 seconds more times than I can count, and I still don't think I can fully describe the specific collapse that moved across her face. Not shock exactly, because some deep, denied part of her clearly already knew, but the particular horror of watching a private arithmetic you've spent years refusing to finish suddenly get finished for you, in public, under a chandelier, in front of everyone who has ever mattered to your carefully curated life. The wine glass slipped from her hand at 8:21 p.m. and shattered against the parquet floor, and the sound of it, sharp and small against the low hum of 300 conversations, was the first thing that made the room actually stop. Marcus turned toward the sound, toward his wife, and then followed her line of sight across the room, and I watched him see Richard Ashford for what I am fairly certain was the first time he had ever laid eyes on the man in person. Watch some version of the same arithmetic assemble itself behind his eyes, faster than Bianca's had, because Marcus, whatever else he was, had never been stupid, only dishonest, and the two are not the same thing. He didn't drop anything, he went very still instead. The specific stillness of a man doing rapid, silent calculations about how much of his life had just become unrecoverable. And it was in that stillness, that 4-second window where the entire room had gone quiet enough that you could hear the string quartet in the corner finish a phrase and then simply stop. Unsure whether to continue, that I saw the 2 FBI agents near the west exit begin moving. Unhurried, purposeful, the way people move when they have been waiting for exactly this moment and have nothing left to figure out. I want to tell you honestly that I did not orchestrate the timing of Bianca's wine glass, or the specific 4 seconds in which 2 entirely separate secrets collided in front of 300 witnesses. What I had orchestrated, what my father and Patricia Delgado's team and I had spent 6 weeks building toward, was simpler and colder. The certainty that whenever the personal collapse happened, and I had believed, given everything Preston Eicher told me, that it eventually would, the financial one would be standing right next to it, ready to happen in the exact same room, so that neither Marcus nor Bianca nor Diane would ever get the chance to control the narrative the way the Whitfield family had controlled every narrative for 3 generations. Patricia's agents had been briefed to move the moment either investigative thread became publicly visible, on the theory, which turned out to be exactly correct, that a family capable of covering up an affair for years was equally capable of trying to quietly walk Marcus out a side door the second anything went wrong, and Patricia was not going to let that happen in a room with 300 witnesses and a reunion committee's worth of cell phone cameras already coming out. One of the agents, a woman named Special Agent Renata Cho, no relation to my managing partner, a coincidence I noted absurdly in the middle of everything else happening, because apparently my brain needed something small and ordinary to hold on to, reached Marcus first, at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered near the shattered glass, and I heard her say, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to and no farther, "Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to need you to step outside with me. We have some questions regarding Whitfield Capital Partners." Diane Whitfield, who had been across the room accepting a compliment on the floral arrangements, arrived at her son's side within seconds, arrogance intact even in that moment, and said, loudly enough that at least 40 people turned to look, "I'm sorry, is there a problem? Do you have any idea whose family you're speaking to?" A sentence that, I am told, made it verbatim into at least 6 separate group chats among our graduating class before the night was even over, and that Agent Cho answered with a patience I found genuinely admirable, holding up a folded document and saying, "Ma'am, this is a federal asset freeze order that includes your personal checking account at First Meridian Trust. I'd recommend you come with us as well." Diane Whitfield's face, for the first time in 11 years of knowing her, did something I had never once seen it do. It went completely blank. Trevor, 12 feet away, had gone the color of the tablecloth, his half-finished raw bar business plan and its $650,000 in stolen seed capital evidently assembling itself in his head in real time, and he actually physically turned, and tried to walk toward the exit closest to the coat check, only to find a second agent already positioned there, having anticipated, correctly, that someone in that family would eventually try exactly that. Camille Torres, near the head table, simply sat down in the nearest chair. Hard, both hands pressed flat against the white tablecloth, and I watched her mouth move without sound, and I would learn later, from the deposition transcript, that what she'd been saying, over and over, was, I didn't know, I just did what he told me," a sentence that would turn out to matter quite a lot less to a federal jury than she apparently hoped it would. And Bianca hadn't moved from the spot where the glass shattered, standing in a small halo of broken Sancerre and champagne silk, staring across the room at Richard Ashford, who was staring back at her with an expression that had, underneath its own visible panic, something that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of a man who has finally, after years of moving the date, run out of ability to keep moving it. Sarah Kessler stood beside him, holding Miles, who had started to fuss quietly, tired, overwhelmed by the noise and the sudden stillness of a room that had been loud a moment before, and I watched Sarah's face cycle through confusion, and then, as she looked at Bianca, at the shattered glass, at the way half the room's attention had split between the two women, something that looked like a slow, sick understanding of her own that had nothing to do with any wire transfer at all. Marcus went with Agent Cho without protest, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, and as he passed within a few feet of me, close enough that I could smell the same cologne he'd worn for the entire 11 years I knew him, he stopped, just for a second, and said, quietly, so quietly I don't think anyone else heard it, "Did you know about all of it?" And I understood in that moment that he genuinely could not tell whether the woman standing in front of him in an emerald green dress was the same woman he'd left in a hotel room 8 years earlier, or something else entirely, something he'd never actually let himself see clearly even when we were together. I said, "I know everything, Marcus. I've known everything for 6 weeks." And then I said, the thing I had not planned to say, the thing that arrived in my mouth, fully formed, the way true things sometimes do, borrowed, deliberately, from the exact words he'd used at the bar 40 minutes earlier. And I want you to know, I don't regret any of it. Finding all of this was the best decision I ever made. His face, in that moment, was the only apology I ever got, and it turned out to be enough. The room did not go back to normal after Marcus was let out, the way rooms sometimes do in movies, everyone quietly returning to their canapes as if nothing happened. 300 people stood frozen in various states of horrified fascination, phones held low but still recording, the string quartet still not playing, a caterer standing in the doorway with a tray of past appetizers she had apparently forgotten she was holding. Bianca finally moved, crossing the broken glass in her heels without seeming to notice or care, walking directly toward Richard Ashford with a controlled fury I had genuinely never seen from her in 19 years of friendship. Not even the year her father died, not even the year her first serious boyfriend cheated on her with a girl from our dorm. "You brought him here," she said, and her voice carried, deliberately or not, to every corner of a room that had gone silent enough to make deliberate carrying unnecessary. "You brought your son here, tonight, of all nights?" And Ashford, to his credit, or perhaps simply because he had run entirely out of road to keep driving down, didn't deny it, didn't deflect, didn't do any of the things I'd half expected a career politician to do under pressure. He said quietly but not so quietly that the nearest 20 people didn't hear every word. I brought him because I'm done pretending he doesn't exist. Bianca, I should have done it years ago, for both our sons. Both our sons. 2 words that confirmed, in front of 300 witnesses, what the paternity lab's $890 charge had only ever let me suspect. I want to tell you what happened to Tyler in that exact moment, because it's the part of the whole night that I still think about more than any other, more than the shattered glass, more than Marcus's question at the bar. A member of the reunion committee, a woman named Julia Park, who I'd gone to prom with a decade earlier, had the presence of mind, in the middle of all of it, to quietly walk over to the children's table, kneel down next to Tyler, and say something to him that made him laugh. And then she picked him up, 5 years old, still holding his crayon, and carried him toward a side room, away from the noise and the broken glass and the 2 federal agents and his grandmother's blank. Frozen face, and I have never in my life been more grateful to a near stranger than I was to Julia Park in that moment. Because whatever else was true about that family and the lies they'd built their lives on, that little boy hadn't asked to be born into any of it, and he deserved, at minimum, not to watch it collapse in real time under a chandelier. My father arrived at 8:40 p.m., not as part of any official capacity. He had, again, deliberately recused himself from anything that could look like judicial involvement. But as my father, a 72-year-old man in a gray suit who walked directly through the wreckage of the Whitfield family's carefully constructed evening, found me standing near the bar exactly where Marcus had left me, and simply put his arms around me without saying anything at all. I hadn't cried once in 6 weeks of forensic work, 6 weeks of diner coffees with Preston Eicher, and conference rooms with Richard Ashford, and luncheons where I smiled at Diane Whitfield in her Chanel jacket. And I didn't cry then either, not really. Just stood there in my father's arms in the middle of a ballroom full of broken glass and federal agents, and a family whose entire mythology had just come apart in front of everyone who'd ever believed in it, and felt, for the first time in 8 years, something that I can only describe as weight finally leaving a body that had been carrying it so long it had stopped noticing the load. Diane Whitfield was not formally arrested that night. The asset freeze was a civil matter, not yet a criminal charge against her personally, though the U.S. Attorney's Office would file conspiracy and money laundering charges against her 4 months later. Once the full extent of her knowing participation in structuring the transfers through her own account became clear from the emails Patricia's team recovered. But she was escorted, that night, out of the Gold Coast room, by hotel security at the Foundation's own quiet request, because the reunion committee, once the shock wore off enough for anyone to think clearly, made a unanimous decision that the Whitfield Family Foundation would no longer be hosting the remainder of the evening. And a woman I barely knew, the current head of the Alumni Guild, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Monica Reyes Fitch, no relation to me despite the shared name, stood on a chair near the band and announced, to a round of stunned but genuine applause, that the bar was staying open, the band was going to keep playing, and that whatever else has happened here tonight, our class deserves to actually see each other. Which turned out to be exactly the right thing to say, because within 20 minutes, in the strange, adrenaline-charged way that trauma sometimes accelerates intimacy, half the room was gathered around me instead of around the head table where the Whitfields used to sit, asking questions, offering support, several of them admitting, quietly, that they'd always found something off about Marcus and Bianca's marriage, but had never known how to say so. By 9:30 p.m., word had reached local press. I never found out precisely how, though I have my suspicions about a bartender with a cell phone and a very fast Twitter account. And by the time I left the Drake at nearly midnight, a small cluster of local news vans had gathered outside on Michigan Avenue, and the story that would run the next morning, under a headline I did not write and did not particularly enjoy seeing. North Shore wealth manager arrested amid fraud probe, family scandal erupts at reunion gala, was already being drafted by a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, who would call my office 3 separate times over the following week, requesting an interview I never agreed to give. Because some things, I decided, belonged to the people who lived them, and not to a byline. I want to tell you what happened to each of them, because I think the specific consequences matter more than any general statement about justice, and because for 8 years I had to watch this family float, entirely unmarked, through a world that seemed to reward them for the exact things that should have sunk them. And there is something I need you to understand clearly before I go any further. None of what happened over the following 14 months happened because of luck or coincidence or some cosmic sense of fairness finally catching up. It happened because of paperwork. because of custodial statements and wire transfer logs and an $890 charge to a genetics lab that a careless man never thought anyone would cross-reference. If you're going through something like this right now, if someone in your life is floating on a lie you can feel but can't yet prove, I want you to remember that the floating always has a bottom. It just sometimes takes longer to find than you'd like. Marcus was indicted 11 weeks after the reunion on 14 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of securities fraud, and 1 count of investment advisor fraud under the Federal Investment Advisors Act. The combined exposure carrying a maximum sentence, on paper, of over 90 years, though everyone involved, including Patricia Delgado herself, understood the actual sentence would land nowhere near that ceiling. He initially pleaded not guilty, retained a white-collar defense attorney out of a firm on LaSalle Street 2 blocks from my own office, and spent 5 months insisting, through that attorney, that the entire matter was a series of accounting irregularities being deliberately mischaracterized by a disgruntled former associate with a personal vendetta. Language that made Renata Cole, my managing partner, laugh out loud when she read the court filing, because disgruntled former associate was, I suppose, one way to describe a woman he'd left at the altar. The strategy fell apart the moment the government produced Walter Osei, the retired Chicago firefighter, as a witness at a pretrial hearing, a 74-year-old man in a cardigan who testified, in a shaking but clear voice, about how he'd trusted Whitfield Capital Partners with $310,000 of pension rollover money, his entire retirement, on the recommendation of a colleague who'd met Marcus at a charity golf outing, and how he'd spent the past year unable to afford a hip replacement his doctor had recommended 2 years earlier, quietly assuming his invested funds simply weren't liquid enough yet to access. There is no accounting irregularity defense that survives a jury watching a man in a cardigan explain why he's been living with untreated hip pain. Marcus pleaded guilty 4 weeks later to 11 of the 14 counts, in exchange for the government dropping the remaining 3, and was sentenced, 9 months after the reunion, to 11 years in federal prison, with a restitution order of $6.4 million that will follow him, functionally, for the rest of his working life, since federal restitution debts survive even bankruptcy. I did not attend the sentencing. I thought about it, turned the choice over in my mind for weeks, and in the end decided that walking into that courtroom would have made the day about me watching him get what he deserved, rather than about the 41 actual victims, Walter Osei among them, finally getting a small measure of acknowledgement for what they'd lost. I read about it instead, in a Tribune article, alone, at my kitchen table, and when I got to the sentence describing Marcus being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt, again, that same strange, quiet absence of feeling I'd felt at the reunion itself. Not joy, not vindication exactly, just the flat, settled sense of a ledger that had finally, after 8 years, been made to balance. Diane Whitfield's case moved more slowly and in some ways ended more harshly than Marcus's own, because the government's theory of her involvement, that she had knowingly allowed her personal checking account to be used as a laundering conduit for stolen client funds, in exchange for a comfortable lifestyle she had every reason to know she could no longer legitimately afford, required proving intent, always the hardest thing to prove, and her attorneys fought it for nearly a year. What broke the case open, in the end, was not a financial document at all, but a text message, recovered from Marcus's own phone during the initial forensic extraction, sent from Diane to Marcus 9 months before the reunion, that read, in full, "The gala budget is short again. You know what to do, you always find a way, just don't tell me the details, I don't want to know them." A sentence that a federal prosecutor would later describe to the jury, in closing argument, as the entire crime, self-narrated, by the defendant herself in 9 words. Diane pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering 14 months after the reunion, 63 years old at sentencing, and received 18 months in federal prison, a sentence that felt, to those of us who'd spent 11 years watching her wear condescension like perfume, almost anticlimactic in its brevity, though I've come to believe the real sentence, for a woman whose entire identity was built on the assumption that some families simply don't answer to consequences, was never the 18 months. It was the house on Sheridan Road, sold at auction 8 months after her plea to cover a portion of the restitution order, the boathouse and the tennis court that had just been resurfaced, $12,000, can you imagine? Now belonging to a hedge fund manager from Winnetka who Diane, I'm told, still refuses to speak to at the one remaining charity function she occasionally attends. Trevor Whitfield was never criminally charged. The government's theory of his liability was weaker, since the money he'd received had been characterized, at least on paper, as loans rather than direct proceeds of the fraud, and proving he'd known the source of the funds proved harder than proving Diane had. Largely because Trevor, true to the single trait that had defined him for the entire 11 years I knew him, had simply never asked enough questions to generate the kind of incriminating paper trail his mother had. But the civil restitution order reached him anyway, through a separate action the government brought to recover the $650,000 that had funded his never-opened raw bar concept on Randolph Street. And Trevor, 36 years old by the time the judgment was entered, found himself, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely and completely broke, with a judgment against him that made it functionally impossible to secure financing for any future venture, incubating or otherwise. He works now, as of the last I heard, through a mutual acquaintance, as an account manager at a wine distributor in the western suburbs, a job that would have once struck him as beneath consideration. And I am told, though I cannot verify it personally, that he has developed something close to genuine humility about it. The specific, chastened humility of a man who spent 36 years assuming the floor beneath him was load-bearing and discovered, all at once, that it had never actually been attached to anything. Camille Torres's case was, in its own way, the saddest of all of them to watch unfold, because unlike Diane, who had known enough to explicitly instruct her son not to tell her the details, and unlike Trevor, who had simply never bothered to ask, Camille had actively, if unknowingly, participated in the operational mechanics of the fraud, signing for packages at the Winnetka P.O. Box, managing the timing of Bianca's schedule around Ashford's, accepting a $9,000 a month consulting retainer for work that, when the SEC's forensic accountants actually itemized it, amounted to roughly 11 hours a month of genuine labor. She was charged with a single count of structuring financial transactions to avoid reporting requirements, a lesser charge than either Marcus or Diane faced, but one that still carried the possibility of prison time. And she took a plea deal that resulted in 3 years of probation, a $40,000 fine she is still paying off in monthly installments, and a permanent bar from working in any capacity for a registered investment advisor. A career-ending provision for someone who had, whatever else was true about her, genuinely believed she'd finally found the best opportunity of her life. I ran into her once, 11 months after the reunion, at a grocery store in Lincoln Park, both of us reaching for the same brand of sparkling water, and she looked at me for a long moment before either of us said anything, and then she said quietly, "I really didn't know how bad it was." And I believed her mostly, the way you can believe someone and still understand that not knowing was itself a choice she'd made, over and over, every time she chose not to ask the one question that would have made continuing impossible. Bianca's consequences were the hardest to categorize, because so much of what happened to her happened in rooms I was never present for. Divorce proceedings, custody negotiations, a public unraveling of an image she'd spent 8 years constructing with the same care Marcus had used to construct his own. But I know, from Julia Park, who stayed close to Bianca even after everything, more than most people would expect. Bianca filed for divorce 9 days after the reunion, before Marcus had even been formally indicted. A decision that I think surprised no one, given that the marriage's entire foundation, financial and emotional both, had collapsed in the same 4-second window. The custody arrangement for Tyler became its own small, quiet drama, complicated enormously by the paternity question that neither Marcus nor Bianca had ever resolved publicly, and that a family court judge, 7 months after the reunion, finally ordered tested formally, at Marcus's own request, in what his attorney described, with a bluntness I found almost admirable given everything else, as the defendant's desire for clarity before entering a decade of incarceration during which he will not see this child grow up. The test confirmed what the $890 charge from 8 years earlier had already told me. Marcus was not Tyler's biological father. Richard Ashford was. Tyler, 5 years old, spent several months in a state of custody limbo that I genuinely do not have the heart to detail, beyond saying that it resolved, eventually, with Bianca retaining primary custody, Ashford agreeing to a quiet, court-ordered child support arrangement, and limited, gradually increasing visitation, and Marcus, from federal prison, voluntarily relinquishing any parental claim, a decision that Julia Park told me. In the one detail about all of this that genuinely surprised me, seemed to come not from bitterness but from something closer to relief, as though some small part of Marcus Whitfield had been waiting 8 years for permission to stop performing a fatherhood he'd always half suspected wasn't his to perform. Richard Ashford resigned his state Senate seat 6 weeks after the reunion, under a cloud of scrutiny that had less to do with any criminal conduct. He was never charged with anything, since infidelity, however publicly humiliating, is not a federal crime, and more to do with the sheer, sustained media appetite for a story involving a sitting legislator, two secret children by two different women, and a fraud scandal all colliding under one chandelier. He now works, according to a brief item I saw in a Springfield political newsletter roughly a year later, in a government relations role for a nonprofit. A quieter life than the one he'd built for himself. And he pays child support, on time and without dispute, for both Tyler and Miles. A small, unglamorous consistency that I choose to believe counts for something, even if it arrived roughly 4 years later than either of those boys deserved it to. I testified twice over the following year. Once before a federal grand jury, a closed proceeding I can't describe in detail, and once, 7 months after the reunion, at Marcus's sentencing hearing, not as a formal witness but as one of several victims' representatives permitted to speak, since my own firm's clients, and by extension the broader public trust in forensic audit findings, had been indirectly harmed by the scale of Marcus's deception. I stood at a podium in a federal courtroom on Dearborn Street, 12 feet from where Marcus sat in a gray jumpsuit, his attorney beside him, and I did not talk about the wedding, or the hotel room, or the 8 years of quietly rebuilding myself into someone who could survive a room like that one. I talked about Walter Osei's hip. I talked about a woman named Doris Kellerman, 68, a retired municipal employee whose $180,000 rollover had funded, in part, the sculpture in the Whitfield Capitol lobby that I'd learned months earlier had cost $180,000 exactly. A coincidence so precise it made Patricia Delgado's whole team go quiet the first time I pointed it out. I talked about the difference between a lie that costs someone their pride and a lie that costs someone their hip replacement, their retirement, their ability to trust the next well-dressed man who tells them he's building something people will respect because he earned it. I did not look at Marcus while I spoke. I looked at Judge Alvarez, a woman in her 50s with sharp, unhurried eyes, and when I finished, she thanked me. And then she looked at Marcus for a long moment before she read the sentence into the record, and I remember thinking, watching her, that she reminded me a little of my father, not in appearance, but in that same quality he'd always had, the capacity to hold someone fully accountable without needing to raise her voice to do it. The firm changed how it treated me after the case became public, in ways both larger and smaller than I expected. Renata Cole made me the youngest named partner in Sterling & Cole's history 8 months after the reunion, changing the letterhead to Sterling, Cole, and Reyes, a decision she told me, over drinks the night it was announced, she'd been considering for over a year but had accelerated specifically because, in her words, "You just proved, in the most public possible way, exactly what this firm is supposed to be for." I started getting calls from journalists writing broader pieces about affinity fraud, the specific category of financial crime where trust, rather than deception alone, is the primary tool, where victims are targeted not because they're unsophisticated, but because they belong to a community, a family, a social circle that vouches for the fraudster in ways a stranger never could. And I gave several interviews, carefully, always keeping the focus on the mechanics of the fraud and the victims rather than on the 8-year-old wound that had, without my planning it, become the origin story journalists kept wanting to lead with. I said no to a Dateline producer twice. I said yes, eventually, to a piece in the Wall Street Journal's finance section, 6 months after sentencing, that focused almost entirely on the forensic methodology, the custodial trade confirmation cross-reference, the shell entity tracing, the specific moment I found the $890 genetics lab charge, because I wanted, more than I wanted sympathy or vindication, for other forensic accountants reading it, to learn something they could actually use the next time a case like this landed on their own desk. My mother, who taught high school biology for 31 years before retiring the same spring all of this unfolded, told me something at dinner one night, roughly 10 months after the reunion, that I think about more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that entire period. I'd been describing, somewhat clinically, the process of matching custodial records against fabricated statements, the patient, methodical cross-referencing that had taken weeks. And she said, "You know, that's exactly how I used to teach cellular respiration. You can't see the process directly. You have to look at what it produces and what it consumes and where the energy actually goes, and eventually the invisible thing becomes undeniable, because the evidence of it is everywhere once you know how to look." She wasn't talking about Marcus, not directly, but I understood immediately what she meant, and it stayed with me since. For 11 years, I had been standing next to a fraud, a domestic one, and eventually a financial one, without the tools to see it clearly, because I hadn't yet learned to look at what a life like that actually produces and consumes. The resurfaced boathouse, the $180,000 sculpture, the balloon arch at a 5-year-old's birthday party. Instead of simply accepting the story someone told me about where the energy was coming from. I started dating again, cautiously, about a year after the reunion, and I want to include this not because it's the point of the story, but because I think it matters. For anyone watching this who has spent years assuming their own capacity for trust got permanently damaged by someone else's lie, to hear that it didn't, not for me, not entirely. I dated a structural engineer named James Okafor for 4 months, someone I met, appropriately enough, at a continuing education seminar on forensic methodology, that he'd wandered into by mistake looking for a different conference room, and though it didn't last, we wanted different things, geographically, and neither of us pretended otherwise. It reminded me that the specific damage Marcus had done wasn't to my capacity for connection generally. It was to my capacity to ignore evidence I didn't want to see, and if anything, that particular capacity is one I'm now permanently, gratefully incapable of losing again. There's a detail I left out of the sentencing description that I want to go back to now, because it's the piece of this whole story that I think about on the anniversary of that Thursday night in October, more than any other single moment, more even than the shattered wine glass. During Marcus's sentencing hearing, before Judge Alvarez read the final number into the record, the government's attorney read a list, into evidence, of every victim's name and every dollar amount recovered on their behalf through the asset freeze and subsequent restitution order. It took 9 minutes to read. 41 names. I had met exactly 2 of them in person by that point. Walter Osei, whose hip replacement, I'm glad to report, finally happened 4 months after the freeze recovered enough of his funds to cover it, performed at Rush University Medical Center by a surgeon he told me, when I visited him afterward, finally got me walking without wincing for the first time in 2 years. And Doris Kellerman, the retired municipal employee whose rollover had partly funded that absurd $180,000's lobby sculpture, who used a portion of her recovered funds to finally take the trip to Lisbon she'd been postponing for 6 years, and who sent me a postcard, unprompted, 6 weeks later, that I still keep taped to the inside cover of my case files for a reason I've never fully been able to articulate, except that it reminds me, on the days when forensic accounting feels like nothing but spreadsheets and subpoenas, what the spreadsheets are actually for. The Whitfield Family Foundation dissolved formally 9 months after the reunion. Its remaining board members, none of whom had any knowledge of the fraud, I should say clearly, since 3 of them were longtime family friends who'd volunteered their time in good faith for over a decade, voting to wind down operations and redirect the foundation's remaining, legitimately sourced assets, roughly $340,000, to a scholarship fund at Lake Forest Academy that was, in a detail I found almost too on the nose to be real when Monica Reyes-Fitch told me about it, renamed the following spring to something that had nothing to do with the Whitfield name at all. The reunion committee, meanwhile, the same group that had scrambled in real time to keep the band playing and the bar open while federal agents walked Marcus Whitfield out of a ballroom, decided, 3 months later, to hold an actual second reunion event, smaller, at a different venue, a converted warehouse space in the West Loop that Monica had found and that carried none of the Drake Hotel's particular ghosts, specifically so that our graduating class could gather one more time without the shadow of that chandelier hanging over everything, and I went. And it was, against every expectation I walked in with, one of the genuinely good nights of that entire year, full of people who had spent a decade assuming they knew the shape of each other's lives, finally getting to actually ask. I think about Tyler more than I expected to, given that I have no relationship with him at all, and likely never will. He'll be 13 by the time this video is old enough for the algorithm to have mostly forgotten it. Old enough, probably, to understand at least the outline of what happened the year he was 5. And I hope, in whatever way a stranger's hope can matter for a child she's never met, that whoever explains it to him, Bianca, presumably, since I understand she's rebuilt a quiet, unglamorous life for the 2 of them in a smaller apartment in Evanston, working now as an actual marketing coordinator rather than a curated Instagram fantasy. 311,000 followers down to under 4,000 within about 6 weeks of the scandal breaking. Explains it to him with more honesty than any of the adults in that room managed to give each other for the better part of a decade. I hope somebody tells him that none of it was his fault, the way I wish. At 8 years old, someone had told me clearly and often enough that whatever had gone wrong between my own parents in the years before their eventual amicable divorce when I was 11 wasn't something I'd caused either. A lesson it took me most of my 20s to actually internalize. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with my father before I started putting this story together to tell you all of it, because I think it's the closest thing I have to a real answer for the question I know some of you are already forming in the comments. Was it worth it? Did tearing all of that down actually fix anything, or did it just replace one kind of ruin with another? We were sitting on the dock at the lake house, late September, almost exactly a year after the reunion, and I asked him, directly, whether he thought I'd done the right thing. Whether there was a version of all of this where I could have just handed the SEC referral to a colleague and stayed out of it entirely, the way any reasonable senior partner probably should have, given the obvious conflict of interest. He was quiet for a long moment, the specific quiet he uses when he's actually thinking rather than performing thoughtfulness, and then he said, "Elena, you didn't tear anything down that wasn't already hollow. You just made the hollowness visible to everyone standing on top of it. That's not destruction. That's just honesty, arriving late." I don't know if that's exactly true philosophically. I know it's the sentence I hold on to on the nights when the whole thing still feels less like justice and more like a controlled demolition I happen to be standing closest to. But I think on balance most nights that my father was right. Some floors need to be exposed as hollow before anyone standing on them gets hurt worse than a scraped ego and a returned engagement ring. Preston Eicher deserves more space in this story than I've given him so far. Because without a laid-off security guard's willingness to call a woman he barely knew and tell her something that could easily have been none of his business, I don't think the Loop B side of all of this ever surfaces in time to matter. And Tyler and Miles both might have grown up years longer inside a lie that was actively, structurally hurting them. I asked Preston over that same diner coffee months later why he'd made the call at all, given that he had nothing obvious to gain and, in a family as litigious as the Whitfields, plenty to potentially lose. He shrugged and said something I've turned over many times since. I watched that little boy at 4 different foundation events over 2 years, and every single time his mother's eyes were somewhere else in the room. I don't know. Felt like somebody should say something before he got old enough to notice that for himself. I offered him consulting work at Sterling Cole & Reyes 6 months later, formalizing what had essentially already become an informal partnership on 2 subsequent unrelated cases, and he now runs our Physical Security and Surveillance Liaison Division, a job title we more or less invented for him because nothing in our existing organizational chart quite captured what he actually does, which is notice things other people have trained themselves not to see. Richard Ashford's political unraveling took longer to fully play out than the financial one, largely because political consequences move on election cycles rather than court calendars. He resigned his Senate seat 6 weeks after the reunion, as I mentioned, but the more interesting part to me was the press conference he held on the steps of the state capitol building 3 days before that resignation took effect. A performance I watched, along with what the local news estimated at nearly 2 million other people online, with a complicated mixture of feelings I still haven't fully sorted out. He did not do the thing politicians in scandal usually do, the tearful, strategically vague apology to anyone I may have hurt, the careful non-admission wrapped in the language of accountability. He named Sarah Kessler. He named Miles. He named Tyler and Bianca by name in front of every camera in the building, and he said, in a line that ran on every local broadcast that night, and that I've never quite been able to decide whether I find admirable or simply the last calculated performance of a career built entirely on performance. I spent years thinking silence was protecting the people I loved. It was only ever protecting me. Sarah Kessler, for her part, moved with Miles to Madison, Wisconsin roughly a year later, closer to her own family, and built what I understand, through the same mutual acquaintance grapevine that keeps me loosely updated on most of this, to be a quiet, stable life as a policy researcher at the university there. Ashford's child support arriving reliably, if not exactly warmly, every month. I want to say something about the genre this story might sound like it belongs to, because I've watched enough videos like this one to know the shape people expect. Wronged woman engineers elaborate revenge. Wronged woman watches her enemies suffer. Wronged woman rides off into a satisfying, uncomplicated sunset while the credits roll on everyone else's ruin. That is not, if I'm honest with you, entirely what this was, and I think the parts that don't fit that shape are the parts most worth telling. I did not enjoy watching Diane Whitfield's face go blank when Agent Cho held up that asset freeze order. I felt something closer to a held breath finally releasing, which is not the same thing as joy, however much the algorithm that will decide whether this video gets recommended to you might prefer that it were. I did not feel triumphant reading about Trevor's judgment, or watching Camille's face in that grocery store aisle, or hearing that Tyler had to sit through a paternity test at 5 years old because two adults spent years too cowardly to have an honest conversation with each other. What I felt across all 14 months of legal proceedings and every single consequence I've described to you was something much quieter and, I think, much more durable than revenge ever could have been. The specific, settled relief of finally being believed. Not by Marcus, not by Diane, by the numbers themselves, which do not lie, which never once, across 11 years of my trying and failing to make sense of a family that never fully let me in, cared whose name was on the wine glass or whose family had always hosted. Sterling, Cole, and Reyes launched a dedicated affinity fraud unit 14 months after the reunion, funded partly by consulting fees from 3 separate state pension funds who came to us in the aftermath of the Whitfield case, wanting audits of their own external fund managers, a service that has, in the 18 months since, uncovered 2 smaller but structurally similar frauds, one involving a financial advisor embezzling from a synagogue's retirement committee in Skokie, the other involving a youth sports league treasurer in Aurora who had been quietly draining registration fees for 4 years. Neither case had the personal history of the Whitfield case. Both cases, I want you to understand, mattered exactly as much, because the arithmetic of stolen trust doesn't actually care whether the person doing the stealing once broke your heart. Walter Osei's hip mattered the same amount whether or not I happened to have once been engaged to the man who stole from him. I didn't fully understand that distinction until well after the reunion, and I think it's the single most important thing this entire experience taught me about the difference between vengeance and accountability. Vengeance needs a personal wound to justify itself. Accountability doesn't need anything except evidence and the willingness to follow it all the way to the end, regardless of whose name is attached to the account. I still have the wedding dress. I want to tell you that because I think it's the detail that surprises people most when I mention it in interviews. More than the $6.4 million, more than the 18 months, more than any single number in this entire story. It hung in a garment bag in the back of my parents' hall closet in Naperville for 6 years, untouched, until the spring the Whitfield Capital file landed on my desk, when I drove out one Sunday, unannounced, and took it out of the closet myself. And instead of doing what I'd always assumed I'd eventually do, donate it, sell it, burn it dramatically in some cathartic backyard ritual that exists mostly in movies, I had it altered. Not into another wedding dress, into a floor-length column gown, ivory silk, sleeveless, structurally almost unrecognizable from what it started as, except to the seamstress and to me. And I wore it, for the first time, to the Sterling, Cole, and Reyes name partner announcement dinner, 8 months after the reunion, the night Renata Cole put my name on the letterhead. Nobody in that room, watching me give a short, unremarkable speech about client trust and forensic rigor, had any idea they were looking at a dress that had once been sewn for an entirely different life, one that never actually happened, altered into something structurally sound enough to hold up the life that did. I think about that dress more than I think about the chandelier, honestly, because the chandelier was other people's reckoning. The dress was mine. The thing about spending 8 years quietly rebuilding yourself into someone new is that you don't always notice it happening in real time, and it wasn't until roughly a year after the reunion, sitting across from a colleague at a conference in Denver who asked me, casually, over conference hotel coffee, whether I'd always wanted to be a forensic accountant, that I actually had to stop and think seriously about the answer. The honest answer is no. At 23, I wanted to be exactly what Marcus once described wanting to be himself. Ironically enough, someone who built something people respected. Though at 23, I hadn't yet learned that respect built on someone else's ledger. His family's name, his family's boathouse, his family's carefully maintained fiction, was never actually mine to inherit, and wasn't, in the end, even his. What I became instead, slowly, unglamorously, across 11 years of noticing small inconsistencies I used to talk myself out of noticing, is someone whose entire professional identity is built on the single premise Marcus's whole life was constructed to avoid. That the truth, eventually, always shows up in the numbers, whether or not anyone wants it to. My relationship with my mother changed too, in ways I didn't fully expect, mostly because the biology teacher metaphor she gave me about cellular respiration turned into something we returned to, again and again over the following 2 years. A shared language for talking about a period of our lives that neither of us had ever quite known how to discuss directly. She retired the same spring the case broke, 31 years teaching at the same public high school in Naperville, and she told me, at her own retirement dinner, in front of maybe 40 former students and colleagues, a story I'd never heard before, about a student in her second year of teaching who'd been quietly, severely failing every test despite obviously understanding the material in class discussion, and how it had taken her 3 full months to realize the girl couldn't actually see the board clearly and had been too embarrassed to say so. "Sometimes the evidence is right there," my mother said, looking directly at me across that banquet table, "and the only thing standing between you and understanding it is finally being willing to ask the uncomfortable question." I don't think she was only talking about a student from 1987. I think for the first time, my mother was telling me, in the careful, oblique way she's always communicated the things that matter most to her, that she'd known, on some level for years, that something in my relationship with Marcus had never quite added up, and that she'd been waiting, patiently, for me to be ready to ask the uncomfortable question myself. I started roughly a year and a half after the reunion, quietly mentoring young forensic accountants coming up through the field, mostly women, mostly through a program the Illinois CPA Society runs for early career professionals, because I remembered vividly what it felt like at 26, sitting in rooms full of men twice my age who assumed, incorrectly and repeatedly, that the quiet woman running the numbers in the corner couldn't possibly be the one who'd find the discrepancy first. I tell them all some version of the same thing I eventually had to learn for myself, at considerable personal cost, that the instinct to notice when something doesn't add up is not paranoia, and it is not disloyalty, and it is not, whatever anyone in your life who benefits from your silence might tell you, being too sensitive. It is, in fact, the single most valuable professional and personal skill a person can develop. And the only real difference between the people who get away with things and the people who don't is whether someone in the room was willing to keep counting even after being told, explicitly or otherwise, to stop. People ask me, more than almost anything else, why I decided to tell this story publicly at all, given that I spent the actual 6 weeks of the investigation being almost pathologically private about it, refusing interviews, declining the Dateline producer, keeping my head down through 14 months of court proceedings while journalists circled looking for the version of this story that centered heartbreak instead of forensic methodology. The truthful answer took me a long time to arrive at, and it has less to do with closure, a word I've come to actively distrust, and more to do with something my father said to me on that dock a year after the reunion, when I asked him whether he thought I'd done the right thing. He didn't just tell me the floor was already hollow. He said something else, afterward, that I left out earlier because I wanted to save it for now. The reason people like the Whitfields get away with it as long as they do isn't that they're smarter than everyone else, Elena. It's that everyone else assumes someone else is already checking. You stopped assuming that. Most people never do. Sequet. I think about how many rooms I sat in for 11 years assuming that someone, Charles Whitfield, the family's accountant, some invisible adult in charge, was surely handling the numbers responsibly, simply because the house was big and the tennis court had just been resurfaced. I think about how many of you watching this right now are sitting in some version of that same room, assuming someone else is checking, when the truth is, more often than any of us want to admit, nobody is checking at all until one person decides to be the one who finally does. So here is the actual lesson, if you've stayed with me this long. The one thing I'd want you to take out of 11 years of my life and turn into something useful for your own. The specific feeling of noticing something doesn't add up, a story that's slightly too smooth, a lifestyle that doesn't match the numbers you can actually see, a person who turns their wine glass by the stem every single time they say something they don't quite believe. That feeling is not a character flaw you need to talk yourself out of. It is data. It is the single most reliable early warning system most of us are ever given, and the people who most need you to stop trusting it are, without exception, the people who benefit the most from your silence. I spent 11 years being told, in 100 small, elegant, socially acceptable ways, that noticing was rude, that noticing was ungrateful, that noticing meant I simply wasn't refined enough to understand how families like the Whitfields operated. I want you to understand, watching this video, wherever you are, whatever version of a resurfaced boathouse someone in your life has been asking you not to look at too closely. You were never the problem for noticing. The numbers were always going to catch up eventually. The only real question was ever whether you'd be the one holding the evidence when they did, or whether you'd spend another 11 years hoping someone else would do it for you. I think about Walter Osei's hip more than I think about almost anything else from this entire story. More than the chandelier, more than the 18 months, more than the dress hanging in my closet in its new, altered shape. Not because his was the largest dollar amount. It wasn't, not by a wide margin. Several of the 41 victims lost considerably more. but because it was the most concrete, the most physical, the most undeniable proof of what abstraction like 6.4 million in misappropriated client assets actually costs a real person in a body that hurts every single day it goes untreated. I keep his postcard from Doris Kellerman's Lisbon trip taped inside my case files, and I keep, mentally, the image of Walter walking without wincing for the first time in 2 years. Because both of those things are the actual point of everything I do now. The reason a career built on spreadsheets and subpoenas has never once felt, to me, like anything less than the most meaningful work I could possibly be doing with the specific, hard-won skill I spent 8 years developing out of the wreckage of a wedding that never happened. If a broken engagement is the price it cost me to become someone who can find $6.4 million hidden inside 40,000 pages of falsified statements, someone who can hand a retired firefighter back his ability to walk without pain, I have made a kind of peace, slow and imperfect and still occasionally interrupted by a bad night, with the trade. So, let me ask you the question I've been building toward this entire time. The one I think you already know the answer to if you've watched this far. If you've commented your city, if you've sat with me through 11 years of Whitfield family dinners and 6 weeks of forensic audits and 1 shattered wine glass under a chandelier on Michigan Avenue. If you already know, somewhere in your gut, that something in your own life doesn't add up, a number that's too smooth, a story that's too convenient, a person who turns their glass by the stem every time they tell you something you desperately want to believe, what exactly are you still waiting for permission to go count for yourself? I need to go back and tell you about a moment I skipped over, because it happened out of order chronologically, but it belongs here, in the reckoning, more than it belonged earlier in the investigation itself. My deposition of Bianca, 4 months after the reunion, in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office on Dearborn Street, part of the broader civil discovery process tied to a class action the 41 victims eventually filed alongside the criminal case. I wasn't required to be in that room. I was there in my professional capacity as the forensic consultant who'd traced the original fraud, technically present to answer questions about methodology if opposing counsel raised any, and I sat, mostly silent, at the far end of a long table while a government attorney asked Bianca, under oath, question after question about what she had known, and when, about her husband's business. She looked different than she had at the reunion, thinner, the specific kind of thin that comes from months of stress rather than discipline, her hair pulled back plainly instead of styled for 300,000 followers, and I watched her answer questions in a flat, careful voice that I recognized, uncomfortably, as the same voice I'd used for most of the 6 weeks leading up to that gala, the voice of someone who has learned to keep every feeling folded down small enough to survive a formal proceeding. She testified that she hadn't known the specific mechanics of the fraud, a claim the government's attorneys ultimately accepted, since no evidence ever surfaced tying her directly to the wire transfers or the shell entity. But when the questioning turned, unexpectedly, to a line of inquiry about household spending, about whether she'd ever questioned the source of funds for the Positano trips, the balloon arch, the $4,200 birthday party, something in her composure finally cracked, and she said quietly, into the silence of that conference room, I told myself he was just better at this than I understood. I told myself that's what confidence looks like when you're actually good at your job. I recognized that sentence. I had told myself an almost identical version of it, 11 years earlier, watching Marcus turn a wine glass by its stem and call a foundation shortfall handled. Bianca and I had, in the end, made almost exactly the same mistake, at almost exactly the same distance from the truth. And the only real difference between us was that I eventually got the professional tools to stop making it, and she never did, not until a 2-year-old boy walked through a ballroom door and made the mistake impossible to keep making. I didn't say anything to her in that deposition room, and she didn't say anything to me, not directly, though I caught her looking at me once, near the end, a long, unreadable look that I've turned over many times since, without ever quite deciding what it meant. Regret, maybe. Or something closer to recognition, 2 women who'd once shared a childhood on Elm Street in Oak Park, who'd once known each other's exact laughs and exact fears and exact handwriting from 19 years of past notes in classrooms, finally seeing each other clearly across a table designed for adversaries, both of us having built our entire adult identities in wildly different directions around the same unbearable question: what do you do when the person you built your life around turns out to have been lying to you the entire time? I think about the difference in our answers more than almost anything else from that whole period. I turned my version of that question into a career, into a forensic methodology, into 11 years of learning to distrust anything that looked too smooth. Bianca turned hers into 311,000 followers, and a curated life that required constant, exhausting maintenance to keep the cracks from showing. A performance so demanding that I genuinely believe, watching her in that deposition room, some part of her was relieved when it finally, catastrophically ended, the same way some part of me had been relieved, 8 years earlier, once the initial devastation of the canceled wedding gave way to the strange, clarifying freedom of no longer having to pretend the Whitfield family's version of respectability was something I needed to earn. We are not friends now. I don't imagine we ever will be again, and I've made peace with that in a way I genuinely could not have predicted 8 years ago, when losing her felt, for a period of months, almost as devastating as losing Marcus. But I don't hate her either, not anymore, not really. I think in the end we were both looking for the same thing in that family. A place to belong, a story about ourselves that felt bigger and safer than the ones we grew up with. And we simply found two entirely different ways of discovering, at nearly the same moment, in nearly the same room, that the story had never been true. I want to describe the second reunion, the one Monica Reyes Fitch organized 3 months after everything fell apart, in more detail than I gave it earlier, because it's the closest thing this story has to an ending that actually felt like mine rather than something that happened to me. The West Loop warehouse space Monica found had exposed brick and string lights instead of chandeliers and gold leaf ceiling medallions. A deliberate choice, she told me later, because I wasn't about to make any of us stand under crystal again after everything. I arrived alone, in a dress I'd bought new, not altered from anything, a deep blue that had no history attached to it at all, and I remember standing near the entrance for a moment before walking in, bracing myself out of 11 years of habit for the specific social calculus of a Whitfield family event. Who was watching? Who was measuring? Whose approval I still needed to perform for? And then remembering, with a kind of physical relief I felt in my shoulders before I felt it anywhere else, that there was no one left in that particular hierarchy whose approval mattered anymore. Diane wasn't there, Trevor wasn't there. The whole family, in fact, had simply stopped being invited to anything, quietly and without anyone needing to say so explicitly, the way a name simply falls off a guest list once the reasons for including it disappear. I spent most of that night talking to people I genuinely lost touch with over 11 years of orbiting the Whitfield family's particular gravity. A classmate named Farrah Wilkins, who'd become an ER physician in Milwaukee, and told me over a second round of drinks that she'd always found something performed about Marcus, and had simply never known how to say so without sounding paranoid. A man named David Osei, no relation to Walter as far as either of us could determine, who ran a small architecture firm and asked me, with genuine and slightly overwhelming curiosity, whether forensic accounting was as much like detective work as it looks on TV. A question I answered for probably 20 minutes longer than the question technically warranted, because it turns out I have a great deal to say about custodial trade confirmations when someone actually wants to listen. Julia Park found me near the small, unglamorous bar around 11, and we talked, for the first time since the reunion itself, about Tyler, about the specific ache of watching a 5-year-old carried out of a room mid-collapse, and she told me something I hadn't known, that she'd stayed in touch with Bianca afterward, quietly, not out of loyalty to any version of the old story, but simply because, in her words, somebody had to make sure that kid had at least one adult in his life who wasn't either in prison or lying to him. And I found myself, listening to her, more moved than I expected by the fact that decency, real, unglamorous, undramatic decency, had quietly outlasted every carefully constructed image in that entire family's collapse. My father came, briefly, at Monica's specific invitation. She'd wanted, she said, to properly thank the retired federal judge whose 40-minute phone call had ultimately protected 41 people's retirements, though of course she framed it publicly as simply a reunion committee guest, never mentioning the specific mechanics of what he'd actually done. He stayed for exactly 1 hour, drank exactly 1 glass of the mediocre red wine the warehouse space was serving, and before he left, he found me near the string lights and said quietly, in the same flat, settled voice he'd used on the dock a year later, "You look like yourself again, Elena." I haven't seen that in a long time. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I thought about it later, driving home, that for 11 years, some version of me had been performing a slightly smaller, slightly more careful person for the Whitfield family's benefit, and that the version of me standing in a West Loop warehouse in a new dress with no history attached to it, talking for 20 minutes about custodial trade confirmations to a stranger who actually wanted to hear it, was simply, finally, the size I'd always actually been underneath all that careful smallness. I left that second reunion around midnight, walked out into a cool September night, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the warehouse, looking back at the string lights through the windows, at 300 people who had watched me get left at an altar 8 years earlier, now laughing, dancing, being ordinary and unguarded, in a room with no chandelier and no head table, and no family whose approval any of us needed anymore. I thought about the dress hanging in my closet, altered into something structurally sound. I thought about Walter Osei walking without wincing. I thought about the $890 charge to a genetics lab that no one, including the man who paid it, ever expected a forensic accountant to find. And I thought, standing on that sidewalk, that if you had told 23-year-old me, sitting across from Marcus Whitfield at that restaurant on Rush Street, turning his wine glass by its stem and telling me he wanted to build something people respected because he'd earned it, that 11 years later, I would be the one who'd actually built that. A reputation earned dollar by trace dollar. Evidence by patient evidence, with nothing inherited and nothing borrowed and nothing resting on a family name that turned out to be built over a hole no one had bothered to check. I don't think she would have believed it was possible. I'm glad now that she never had to know how long the road actually was. I'm gladder still that I walked it anyway. I want to tell you a little more about those two later cases, the Synagogue Retirement Committee in Skokie and the Youth Sports League in Aurora, because I think they matter to this story in a way that goes beyond simply demonstrating that the affinity fraud unit worked. The Skokie case involved a financial advisor named Gerald Feld, 61 years old, a longtime congregant at the synagogue whose retirement committee had trusted him for 9 years, precisely because he was one of them, because he sat in the same pews, sent his children to the same religious school, showed up to the same seders, and it took a whistleblowing bookkeeper's tip and 11 weeks of my team's work to trace $890,000 he'd quietly diverted from the committee's pooled investment account into a series of increasingly desperate bets meant to cover a earlier, smaller shortfall he'd created years before anyone noticed. A pattern so structurally similar to what I'd found in Whitfield Capital's records. Steady, plausible quarterly statements masking transactions that had simply never occurred. That one of my junior associates joked, not entirely as a joke, that fraud, at its core, only really has about 6 different shapes, and once you've learned to recognize one of them, you start seeing its outline everywhere. The Aurora case was smaller in dollar terms, $61,000 over 4 years, but I think about it just as often, because the treasurer, a woman named Kathy Vance, had been the single most trusted, most beloved volunteer in a youth soccer league of nearly 400 families. The person everyone assumed was simply generous with her time because she genuinely loved the kids, when in reality she'd been quietly siphoning registration fees to cover a gambling habit her own husband didn't know about until federal investigators showed up at their door. I sat across from 3 parent board members during that investigation, watching them cycle through the exact same disbelief I'd watched Diane Whitfield's face cycle through under that chandelier. The specific, vertiginous horror of discovering that trust, once extended without evidence, can be worn like a costume for years by someone with absolutely no intention of ever earning it. One of those board members, a father named Miguel Torres, no relation to Bianca or Camille, another coincidence of a common last name that made me do a double take the first time I saw it on an intake form, said something to me during that case that I've quoted in 3 separate conference presentations since. I keep thinking, if she could do this and I never noticed, what else have I never noticed? I told him what I've come to believe, across every single case I've worked since the Whitfield investigation, is the only honest answer to that question. Probably something, because all of us have blind spots built out of exactly the same material. The assumption that people who look trustworthy, who show up consistently, who sit in the right pews or coach the right teams or turn a wine glass with the right practiced ease, have therefore earned a level of scrutiny-free trust that no one, honestly, has actually earned simply by being familiar. I don't say that to make anyone watching this paranoid about every coach, every treasurer, every charming person in their life who's ever bought the second round. I say it because the alternative to occasional, healthy scrutiny isn't trust, exactly. It's just exposure, dressed up as faith, and the difference between the two is usually invisible until the exact moment it stops being invisible. The way it was invisible to me for 11 years. The way it was invisible to those Aurora parents for 4. The way it was invisible to that entire Skokie congregation for 9. The skill isn't cynicism, the skill is simply being willing, occasionally, to check, quietly, without accusation, the way my father made one 40-minute phone call instead of a public scene, and to trust the discomfort of what you find more than you trust the comfort of not looking. There's one more thread I haven't closed yet, and it's the one I think about most when people ask me, in the comments of videos like this one, whether I ever forgave Marcus. Because I think forgiveness is the wrong frame entirely for what actually happened between us. And I want to try to explain why, as precisely as I can, because precision is still, after everything, the only thing I've ever really trusted. I wrote Marcus one letter 4 months into his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. Not because I felt he deserved a letter, but because I realized, sitting down to write it, that I had one remaining question I needed answered for myself, more than I needed him to hear anything I had to say. I asked him whether, at any point in our 11 years together, any of it had been real, or whether I had simply been, from the very beginning, a useful accessory to a performance he was already giving before we ever met. Elena Reyes, the hard-working, unglamorous fiancé who made the Whitfield family look, by careful contrast, appropriately grounded and normal. He wrote back 6 weeks later, a single page, and I want to be honest that the letter surprised me, because I had braced myself for either more performance or total silence. And instead, I got something that read, for the first time in the entire 11 years I'd known him, like an actual attempt at honesty, however late and however limited by the fact that honesty, at that point, cost him nothing further to give. He wrote that the early years had been real as he was capable of, which he acknowledged, almost clinically, might not have been very real at all, given everything that came after. He wrote that he thought he'd started lying to me gradually, in small increments so minor he'd stopped noticing them himself. Somewhere around the same dinner on Sheridan Road I remembered. The one where his father winced at the mention of the foundation gala, and that by the time the lies were large enough that stopping felt impossible, he'd convinced himself the alternative, telling me the truth, watching me leave, losing the version of himself he performed at that Rush Street restaurant on our first date, was worse than continuing. He wrote, in the letter's final line, the one I've thought about more than almost anything else in this whole story. I think I left you the night before the wedding because some part of me couldn't stand to watch you find out on your wedding day instead of before it. I told myself that made me kinder. I don't think it did. I did not write back. I didn't need to. I had gotten the only thing I actually went looking for in that letter, which wasn't an apology and wasn't closure in the tidy sense people mean when they use that word. It was simply confirmation that I hadn't spent 11 years failing to notice something that was never there to notice. I had spent 11 years watching, with increasing but suppressed clarity, exactly what was actually happening, and choosing over and over not to trust what I saw, until a forensic audit 6 weeks before a reunion finally gave me no room left to keep choosing that. That, I think, more than the $6.4 million, more than the 18 months, more than the chandelier or the shattered wine glass or the 2 boys who never should have been in the same room, is the actual center of this whole story, the thing I most want you to take with you when this video ends. The lie was never hidden as well as everyone involved wanted to believe it was. It rarely is. Somewhere in your own life right now, if you're honest with yourself, there is probably a version of a wine glass being turned by its stem, a version of handled said in exactly the wrong tone, a version of a boathouse that's been just resurfaced one too many times for the math to actually make sense. You don't need a federal judge for a father, or 11 years of forensic training, or a private equity fund that happens to hire your firm at exactly the right moment. You just need to be willing to be the one person in the room who keeps counting. 18 months after the reunion, on an ordinary Tuesday that started exactly like every other Tuesday had started for almost a year and a half, coffee at 6:45, a run along the lakefront path before the office, a stack of case files waiting on my desk that had nothing to do with anyone named Whitfield, Renata Cole knocked on the frame of my open office door and told me a new client had called that morning. Referred, of all people, by Patricia Delgado's office. A referral Patricia doesn't make lightly and had, as far as either of us could recall, never made before. The client was a widow named Corinne Ashworth, 79 years old, calling about her late husband's estate, a modest fortune built over 4 decades running a family hardware store chain in the western suburbs, and a financial advisor her husband had trusted for over 20 years, a man Corinne described, on the intake call, in words that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up before I'd even opened the file. As practically part of the family, you understand, we've known him since before our daughter was born. I want to tell you I felt nothing when I heard that phrase. That 18 months of hard-won peace had made me immune to the particular chill of hearing practically part of the family attached to someone controlling an elderly widow's life savings. I didn't feel nothing. I felt the same cold, clarifying focus I'd felt at 9:52 p.m. on a Thursday, alone in the office, staring at 11 quarterly statements that didn't match a single custodial trade confirmation. The exact feeling that had once terrified me and that I have since learned to recognize as something closer to purpose. I told Renata to open the file. I told my assistant to clear my Thursday afternoon. And as I sat down at my desk that Tuesday morning with Corinne Ashworth's intake form in front of me, a name I didn't recognize yet but would, within 6 weeks, know better than I know my own handwriting, I thought about my mother's cellular respiration metaphor one more time. You can't see the process directly, you have to look at what it produces and what it consumes. And I picked up the phone to schedule the first call. That's a different story though, one I'm not ready to tell you yet. Because I'm only 4 days into that file and there are things I still don't know, names I still can't confirm, a signature on a power of attorney document that doesn't quite match the one on file from 3 years earlier, close enough to fool a notary and not quite close enough to fool someone who spent 11 years learning exactly what a practiced, comfortable lie looks like up close. I'll tell you about Corinne Ashworth and her practically part of the family advisor once I actually know how it ends. The way I could only tell you about that chandelier and that shattered wine glass once 14 months of court proceedings had run their full course. But I wanted you to know it's already started, that somewhere in a modest ranch house in the western suburbs right now, a 79-year-old widow is sitting with a bad feeling she can't quite name. The exact same bad feeling I spent 11 years talking myself out of trusting. And if there's one thing this entire story has taught me, watching Walter Osei walk without wincing, and Diane Whitfield's face go blank under a chandelier, and Marcus's handwriting confess, 6 weeks too late, to a kindness he never actually managed to give me, it's that the feeling is never wrong for as long as everyone assumes it is. I keep coming back in these final minutes to the specific image of Diane Whitfield's face going blank, because I think it's the moment in this entire story that most people who message me actually want to talk about. More than the wine glass, more than the paternity test, more than the 11 years of small, elegant condescension that preceded it. They want to know what it actually felt like, in the body, to watch a woman who spent a decade calling my career so refreshing in that particular chilled tone, finally understand, in real time, that the ground she'd been standing on her entire adult life had never been solid at all. I've tried, in this video, to be honest that it didn't feel like triumph, and I want to be equally honest that it also didn't feel like nothing, because both of those descriptions are too simple for what was actually a much stranger, much more layered sensation. Something closer to watching a structure you always privately suspected was hollow finally, audibly echo when someone knocks on it in front of witnesses. There is a specific vindication in that sound, quieter than revenge, less satisfying in the moment, and, I've come to believe, considerably more durable afterward, because revenge asks you to keep reliving the wound in order to keep justifying the punishment, while this, evidence, patiently gathered, correctly applied, asks nothing further of you at all once the numbers finally speak for themselves. I think about Walter Osei's cardigan more than I probably should, the specific, ordinary fact of a 74-year-old man in a cardigan describing untreated hip pain to a courtroom, because it's the detail that most completely deflates every glamorous revenge fantasy this story could have been marketed as. There was nothing glamorous about that pretrial hearing. There was nothing cinematic about 11 weeks of custodial statement cross-referencing, about diner coffee with a laid-off security guard, about an $890 charge to a genetics lab in Skokie that took me 3 sleepless nights to fully understand the weight of. The chandelier moment, the shattered wine glass, the 2 FBI agents moving through a crowd of 300 people in cocktail attire. That part looked, I'll admit, almost exactly like the ending of every story in this genre, and I understand why it's the 4 seconds that get clipped and shared and commented on the most. But it was never actually the point. The point was always the 11 quarterly statements that didn't match a single trade confirmation, the 19 wire transfers, the 41 names it took 9 minutes to read into a federal record, and the deeply unglamorous, deeply necessary work of a retired firefighter finally being able to afford a hip replacement he'd needed for 2 years. If you remember one thing from everything I've told you tonight, past the chandelier, past the wine glass, past even the second boy walking through those double doors, I want it to be that the actual undoing of a lie this large was never a single dramatic moment. It was thousands of small, patient, unglamorous ones, stacked carefully on top of each other by a woman who had finally, after 11 years, decided she was allowed to keep counting, even when everyone around her insisted the math didn't matter. I don't know exactly how Corinne Ashworth's story is going to end. I know how it started. A phone call, an intake form, a name I don't recognize yet attached to a signature that doesn't quite match. And I know, with the same cold certainty I felt at 9:52 p.m., staring at 11 mismatched quarterly statements all those months ago, that whatever I find when I finally open that power of attorney file completely, it's going to matter exactly as much as the Whitfield case did, regardless of whether it ever involves a chandelier or a shattered wine glass or a room full of witnesses. I called the notary's office this afternoon, before I sat down to record this. I have a meeting scheduled with Corinne herself on Thursday, at her ranch house in the western suburbs. The same kind of unremarkable, ordinary house Walter O.C. lives in. The same kind of house half of you watching this video probably grew up in yourselves. I don't know yet what I'm going to find there. I know I'm gonna look. There's a version of this story where I never open that Ashford Meridian file at all, where some other associate at Sterling & Cole gets assigned the audit instead of me, where I go the rest of my life never learning that Marcus Whitfield's signature was sitting 3 levels deep inside a client's compliance flag. Never learning about Preston Eicher's time-stamped memory of a stairwell at a winter gala. Never standing in a ballroom under a chandelier watching a 2-year-old boy in a navy blazer walk through double doors and quietly detonate 2 secrets that had been sitting, unexploded, for years. In that version of my life, I imagine I'm still fine, in the specific, functional, slightly hollow way I was fine for 8 years before any of this started. Still a partner at a good firm, still occasionally thinking about Marcus on the anniversary of that Thursday night in October. Still carrying, without fully realizing it, the particular weight of a question I'd never gotten to actually answer. Whether any of it had been real, whether I'd been a fool for 11 years or simply unlucky for one night. Whether the version of myself who trusted him at 23 had been naive in some way I needed to spend the rest of my life apologizing for. I don't have to carry that question anymore, and I think that, more than the restitution order, more than the 18 months, more than the sculpture that turned out to cost exactly what one woman's entire retirement was worth, is the actual gift this whole ordeal gave me. If a federal fraud investigation involving your own ex-fiancé can be reasonably described using a word like gift at all, I know now. Not suspect, not wonder, not quietly reassure myself in the shower at 2 a.m. that I'm probably overthinking it. No, with the same evidentiary certainty I'd bring to any case file, precisely what happened, precisely why, and precisely what it cost, in dollars and in a firefighter's hip, and in a 5-year-old's understanding of who his father is, to let a family that never earned its own respectability spend 3 generations demanding everyone else's anyway. There is a peace in that certainty that no apology, however honest, however late, could ever have given me on its own. Marcus's letter told me the truth mattered to him. Eventually, once it cost him nothing further to admit it. The forensic audit told me the truth regardless of what it cost anyone, which is, I've come to believe, the only kind of truth actually worth building a life around. I think about that 23-year-old version of myself sometimes, sitting across from Marcus at that restaurant on Rush Street, believing every word about legacies earned rather than inherited, and I don't feel embarrassed for her anymore, the way I did for the first several years after the wedding that never happened. I feel something closer to protective. She didn't know yet what a turned wine glass could mean. She didn't know yet that handled was a word people use specifically when they don't want you looking closely enough to see that nothing has actually been handled at all. She had 11 years and 1 canceled wedding and 1 forensic audit still ahead of her before she'd learn any of that. And I wish, sometimes, I could reach back and tell her it was coming, that the room was going to get so much smaller before it got bigger, that the dress in the closet would end up altered into something structurally sound instead of burned in some cathartic ritual, that the boathouse really was hollow the whole time and she was going to be the one standing closest to it when someone finally knocked hard enough to prove it. I can't reach back and tell her any of that, obviously. All I can do is tell you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from, whatever version of a turned wine glass you've been quietly, patiently talking yourself out of noticing for however many years, the room gets smaller before it gets bigger. It always does. And on the other side of noticing, there is a version of your life waiting that no one currently benefiting from your silence wants you to know is even possible. I want to close this part of the story, before I go, with the one image I haven't been able to stop returning to since that night at the Drake. More than the chandelier, more than the shattered wine glass, more than Marcus's question at the bar, or the flatness in his voice when he asked whether I'd known. It's Julia Park, kneeling down next to a 5-year-old boy at a children's table in the back of a collapsing ballroom, making him laugh at something none of the rest of us could hear, and carrying him, still holding his crayon, toward a quiet room away from all of it. I think about that image because it's the one piece of that entire night that had nothing to do with fraud, or revenge, or 11 years of condescension finally getting answered in a room full of witnesses. It was simply one decent person deciding, in the middle of chaos, that a child's afternoon mattered more than anyone's need to watch the spectacle unfold. And I think, in the end, that's the piece of this story I most want people to carry with them. More than the satisfaction of Diane Whitfield's face going blank. More than Trevor's judgment. More than any of the 14 counts read into a federal record over 9 minutes. Accountability matters. Evidence matters. The patient, unglamorous work of tracing 19 wire transfers through 4 accounts matters enormously, more than any single dramatic confrontation ever could on its own. But so does Julia Park kneeling down at a children's table, and so does Walter Osei finally walking without wincing, and so does a $890 charge to a genetics lab that took me 3 sleepless nights to understand the full weight of. Because in the end, every single number in this story, every quarterly statement and every custodial trade confirmation and every restitution dollar was only ever a proxy for something much simpler and much more human. Whether the people who trusted you were right to. Diane Whitfield trusted a story about her family's permanence that turned out to be built over a hole no one had bothered to check. Bianca trusted a version of confidence that turned out to be performance. I trusted, for 11 years, a man who turned a wine glass by its stem every time he told me something he didn't fully believe, and it took a forensic audit and a federal judge and a laid-off security guard's phone call to teach me what should have been obvious all along. Trust that can't survive scrutiny was never actually trust in the first place. It was just hope, dressed up carefully enough that neither of us had to admit how thin it really was. I'm going to leave you here, with Corinne Ashworth's file open on my desk and a meeting scheduled for Thursday at a ranch house in the western suburbs, because I think that's the most honest place to end a story like this one. Not with a bow, not with a tidy sense that the reckoning is finally, permanently complete, but with the ongoing, unglamorous, absolutely necessary work of continuing to look closely at things other people have decided are easier left alone. Before I go, I want to answer the question I know is already forming in some of your comments, because I've been asked a version of it in nearly every interview I've given since the sentencing. Whether I think Marcus ever actually loved me, back at the beginning, before the lies accumulated past the point of return. I've turned that question over more times than I can count. In the letter he sent me from Terre Haute, in 11 years of memory, I've had to re-examine one wine glass gesture at a time, and I've landed, finally, on an answer that surprised me when I first arrived at it. I think it doesn't matter anymore, not in the way it used to feel like it mattered. For years, the question of whether it was ever real felt like the only thing standing between me and being able to move forward, as though I couldn't fully close the door on that chapter of my life until I knew, with certainty, whether the foundation had ever been solid at all. What I understand now, sitting here with Corinne Ashworth's file open beside me, is that the foundation was never actually the point. The point was always whether I was willing to keep checking it, year after year, gesture after gesture, wine glass turn after wine glass turn, instead of simply deciding, out of exhaustion or hope or 11 years of invested history, that some things are better left unexamined. I stopped being willing to leave it unexamined the day a forensic audit landed on my desk with his signature buried 3 levels deep inside it. Everything else, the chandelier, the shattered glass, the 18 months, the second boy walking through those double doors, was just the truth finally getting the room it had been asking for the entire time. Corinne Ashworth called my office again this morning, an hour before I sat down to record this, her voice smaller and more frightened than it had been on the intake call, and she told me something that made my stomach drop the exact same way it had dropped at 9:52 p.m. all those months ago, staring at 11 statements that didn't match a single trade confirmation. She told me her financial advisor had called her that same morning, out of nowhere, after 9 years of monthly check-ins, to ask whether she'd been in touch with any accountants lately. I haven't told anyone at Corinne's house that I'm looking into anything yet. Nobody outside Sterling Colin Reyes even knows her name, which means either that advisor is being extraordinarily careful for no reason at all, or he already knows something is coming, and he's trying to find out exactly how much time he has left before it arrives. I keep thinking about that phone call, the strange, careful way he'd asked about accountants without naming a single one, the specific tenor of a man testing the water before deciding whether to run. I've seen that tenor before. I heard something close to it in Marcus's voice the last time we spoke at that bar, in the half-second before his smile flickered, in the way Diane Whitfield's face went from arrogant to blank in the space of maybe 2 seconds once Agent Cho held up that folded document. People who have spent years building a story eventually develop an instinct for the exact moment the story is about to stop holding. even before they have any real evidence that it's happening. A kind of animal alertness that outruns the facts every single time. If Corinne Ashworth's advisor already has that instinct firing, if he's already circling his own exits before I've even opened the file completely, then whatever I find in that ranch house on Thursday is going to move faster than the Whitfield case ever did. And I don't yet know whether that means I'll have less time to gather what I need, or simply less patience left for waiting once I do. I told Renata this afternoon that I want Preston looped in immediately, timestamps and all, the same instinct that once made him notice a stairwell doorway now aimed at whatever this advisor has been doing for 9 years that a 79-year-old widow never had reason to question. I told my father too, on the phone, driving home, and he was quiet for a moment, the way he always is when he's actually thinking instead of performing thoughtfulness. And then he said, "Elena, you don't need my help with this one. You never really needed it with the last one either. You just needed permission to stop waiting for it." I don't know if that's true. I know it's the sentence I'm going to be thinking about on Thursday morning, standing on Corinne Ashworth's porch in the western suburbs, knocking on a door that's about to tell me, one way or another, exactly how much of her trust has already quietly been spent. I haven't told you his name yet, Corinne's advisor, because I still don't have enough to say it publicly without risking the exact kind of tip-off that lets someone like that quietly move money before an asset freeze can ever catch up to it. The same lesson Patricia Delgado taught me 18 months ago when she told me not to file anything until she'd made one call. But I will tell you this much because it's the detail that made me sit up straight at my desk this morning, the detail that made me call Preston before I'd even finished my coffee. The firm this man works for occupies office space on the same floor, in the same building on Wacker Drive, as a fund with a name I recognized instantly, a name that used to sit on an advisory board alongside a man named Richard Ashford. I don't know yet what that connection means. I don't know if it means anything at all, or if 18 months of forensic work has simply trained me to see patterns and coincidences, the way my mother once taught a classroom of teenagers to see cellular respiration in what a cell produces and consumes. But I know I'm not going to stop looking until I find out, and I know, whatever I find, that I'm going to tell you about it, once it's actually finished. Once the numbers have had their chance to speak for themselves the way they always eventually do. For now, all I have is a knock I haven't made yet, on a door in the western suburbs, and a feeling in my stomach I've learned, the hard way, never to talk myself out of again. I drove out to the western suburbs on Thursday morning like I said I would, and I want to tell you, before I lose the nerve to say it out loud on camera, that I almost turned the car around twice on the way there. Not out of fear exactly, but out of that same strange animal alertness I described a minute ago. The instinct that tells you a room is about to change shape before you've even opened the door. Corinne Ashworth met me on her porch in a cardigan, the same shade of blue as the one Walter Osei wore to that pre-trial hearing. And before I'd even introduced myself fully, before I'd said a single word about power of attorney documents or mismatched signatures, she looked at me and said, "He called again this morning. He asked if I still had his cell number saved in case I ever needed anything urgently. I've had his number saved for 9 years, Elena. Why would he ask me that today?" I didn't answer her right away. I was already pulling my phone out, already texting Preston a single line, "He's running, get eyes on the Wacker Drive office by end of day," because I recognized that sentence, that specific, careful, testing the water sentence, and I knew, standing on that porch with a 79-year-old widow watching my face for a reaction I was trying very hard not to give her, that whatever I was about to find inside that house was going to move faster than anything the Whitfield case had ever asked of me, and that I had maybe hours, not weeks, to find it before he did whatever comes next when a man like that finally decides the story's about to stop holding. Corinne's dining room table was still set for 2, I noticed. A habit she told me she'd never been able to break in the 3 years since her husband passed, and she cleared a space for me among the good china without being asked, laying out a shoebox of paper statements going back to 2015 with the careful, apologetic precision of someone who has spent her whole life believing that asking for help means she's failed at something. I want to tell you that shoebox is where this next story really begins. Not the intake call, not the phone call about the cell number, but that specific, ordinary shoebox on a table set for 2. Because it's the exact same feeling I had 6 weeks before that chandelier, alone at 9:52 p.m. with a cold coffee. The sense that somewhere inside an ordinary stack of paper, an entire structure was quietly waiting to be found. If you want to know what I found when I walked through that door, and what happened 4 hours later when a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway behind mine, That's the next video, and if you've made it this far with me tonight, through 11 years of wine glasses turned by their stems and one shattered glass under a chandelier, I think you already know you're going to click it. Preston texted back 4 words while Corinne was still pouring coffee into a cup that matched a saucer her husband used to drink from every morning for 41 years. 4 words that made my hand go still around my own pen. The same stillness I'd felt once before, at 9:52 p.m., staring at 11 statements that didn't match a single trade confirmation. Car's already here, Elena. Black sedan, tinted windows, engine still running, nobody getting out yet, just idling at the curb, hazards off, like it's waiting for something. Or waiting, patiently, quietly, for someone inside that quiet, ordinary little house to finally finish deciding whether to run. The way every account I have ever traced eventually decides, one way or another, that it can't keep waiting forever either. So do me one favor before you go. Hit subscribe now, because you've already spent the last however many minutes proving you're exactly the kind of person who needs to know how this ends.